The emergence of the Celtiberians represents one of the most fascinating examples of cultural synthesis in ancient Europe. Born from the convergence of Celtic migrants and established Iberian populations during the 8th through 6th centuries BC. This process unfolded across the windswept plateaus and river valleys of central Iberia, creating a distinct civilization that would challenge Rome itself centuries later. Archaeological excavations throughout the central Meseta have revealed clear stratigraphic evidence of this cultural transformation. At sites like Numantia, Los Castillejos de Sanchorreja, and La Osera, archaeologists have identified distinct layers marking the transition from purely Iberian settlements to mixed Celtiberian communities. The lower strata, dating to the 9th and early 8th centuries BC, contain pottery fragments decorated with geometric patterns typical of indigenous Iberian craftsmanship, alongside simple iron tools and bronze ornaments reflecting local metallurgical traditions. Above these layers, beginning around 750 BC, the material record shows dramatic changes. Celtic-style fibulae appear alongside traditional Iberian brooches, while pottery begins incorporating new forms and decorative motifs, clearly derived from Hallstatt traditions. These bronze safety pins, essential for fastening Celtic garments, display the characteristic latent spiral patterns and zoomorphic designs, yet they're crafted using local bronze alloys and techniques. The fusion is particularly evident in the metalwork from this period, where Celtic sword designs are executed with Iberian metallurgical expertise, creating weapons that surpass their purely Celtic or Iberian counterparts in both durability and craftsmanship. The geographic distribution of early Celtiberian settlements follows a clear pattern centred on the Duero River basin and its tributaries. The river system provided both transportation routes for the incoming Celtic populations and fertile valleys suitable for their mixed agricultural and pastoral economy. Major settlements emerged at strategic points along these waterways, particularly where tributaries join the main river or at natural defensive positions on elevated terraces overlooking the valleys. The Tormes River Valley, flowing through what is now the province of Salamanca, became a particularly dense concentration of early Celtiberian sites. Here, the Celtic migrants encountered established Iberian communities who had already developed sophisticated hilltop settlements, or castros, fortified with stone walls and equipped with advanced metallurgical workshops. Rather than displacing these populations, the archaeological evidence suggests a gradual integration process spanning several generations. Excavations at Yecla la Vieja, overlooking the Tormes Valley, have revealed this integration in remarkable detail. The site's earliest Celtiberian phase, dating to approximately 700 BC, shows Iberian-style rectangular houses constructed alongside circular Celtic dwellings. The rectangular structures, built with stone foundations and mud brick walls, represent the indigenous architectural tradition, while the circular houses, with their characteristic central hearths and post-hole patterns, follow Celtic building practices from beyond the Pyrenees. Within a century, however, the architectural styles had merged into a distinctive Celtiberian form. Houses from the 6th century BC at Yecla la Vieja combine rectangular floor plans with Celtic interior arrangements, featuring central hearths surrounded by storage areas and sleeping alcoves. The walls incorporate both Iberian stoneworking techniques and Celtic timber framing methods, creating structures that are both more durable and better adapted to the harsh continental climate of the Meseta. The highlands surrounding the Duero basin provided additional advantages for the expanding Celtiberian communities. The Sistema Central mountain range, stretching from the Portuguese border to the headwaters of the Tagus, offered abundant mineral resources, particularly iron ore deposits that would become crucial to Celtiberian metallurgy. The Montes de Leon and the Cordillera, Cantabrica to the north, provided similar resources, while also serving as natural barriers that helped define Celtiberian territory and protect it from external threats. These mountainous regions also supported the pastoral economy that remained central to Celtiberian culture throughout their history. The high meadows provided summer grazing for cattle, sheep and horses, while the protected valleys offered winter shelter. This transhumant lifestyle, inherited from their Celtic ancestors, shaped Celtiberian settlement patterns and social organisation, creating a network of seasonal camps and permanent settlements connected by ancient droving routes. Material culture analysis from sites across the Celtiberian heartland reveals the sophisticated nature of this cultural fusion. Pottery from the 7th century BC demonstrates the gradual blending of traditions, with vessels that combine Celtic forms with Iberian decorative techniques. Large storage jars, or dolia, follow Iberian proportions and construction methods, but incorporate Celtic-inspired geometric patterns executed in the distinctive red and black colour schemes favoured by local potters. The metalwork from this period represents perhaps the most impressive achievement of early Celtiberian craftsmen. Iron weapons from sites like Las Cogotas combine Celtic typology with superior Iberian metallurgical techniques. Swords from the 6th century BC show the characteristic Celtic leaf-shaped blades, but are forged using advanced quenching and tempering methods that produce steel of exceptional quality. The hilts incorporate both Celtic spiral motifs and Iberian geometric patterns, often inlaid with silver or bronze wire in intricate designs that reflect the artistic sensibilities of both cultures. Fibulae from this period display similar synthesis. While maintaining the basic Celtic safety pin form, Celtiberian craftsmen developed distinctive regional variants that incorporated local artistic elements. The Meseta-type fibulae feature elongated catch plates decorated with incised geometric patterns derived from Iberian pottery designs, while the bow sections often display Celtic-inspired animal motifs executed in the precise angular style characteristic of Iberian metalwork. Bronze belt plaques, another diagnostic artifact of Celtiberian culture, emerged during this period as symbols of warrior status and cultural identity. These rectangular plates, worn suspended from leather belts, combine Celtic warrior iconography with Iberian artistic techniques. The scenes depicted typically show mounted warriors, foot soldiers, and hunting parties rendered in the distinctive silhouette style of Iberian art, yet the narrative content and symbolic meaning derive from Celtic warrior traditions. The linguistic evidence for this cultural synthesis comes primarily from inscriptions dating to the later phases of Celtiberian civilization, but the script system itself provides crucial evidence for the early integration process. Celtiberian inscriptions employ a modified version of the Iberian script, adapted to represent the sounds of a Celtic language. This adaptation required significant linguistic contact and cooperation between Celtic speakers and literate Iberians familiar with the script system. The Iberian script, itself derived from Phoenician writing systems, was primarily syllabic, with each symbol representing a consonant-vowel combination. Celtic languages, however, required representation of consonant clusters and vowel sequences that did not exist in Iberian. The solution developed by Celtiberian scribes involved creating new symbols and modifying existing ones to accommodate Celtic phonology, while maintaining the basic structure of the Iberian writing system. Early Celtiberian inscriptions from the 6th century BC found on pottery sherds and bronze plaques show this adaptation process in progress. Some texts display inconsistent spelling of Celtic words, suggesting scribes were still developing standardized orthographic conventions. Personal names appearing in these inscriptions often show Celtic linguistic elements, combined with Iberian name-forming patterns, providing direct evidence for the intermarriage and cultural integration occurring within Celtiberian communities. The bronze tablet from Botorita, though dating to a later period, preserves what appears to be the most archaic form of written Celtiberian, possibly reflecting linguistic traditions established during this early settlement period. The text includes legal terminology and administrative language that suggest the Celtiberians had developed sophisticated governmental institutions by the 6th century BC, combining Celtic concepts of tribal organisation with Iberian urban administrative practices. Religious practices during this formative period also demonstrate the synthesis of Celtic and Iberian traditions. Votive deposits from sanctuary sites across the Celtiberian territory include objects reflecting both cultural backgrounds. Celtic-style weapons and jewellery appear alongside Iberian religious figurines and ex-voto offerings. The sanctuary at Post Olaboso, active from the 7th century BC onward, has yielded bronze figurines depicting warriors in Celtic dress and equipment, yet executed in the artistic style characteristic of Iberian religious art. The treatment of the dead provides additional evidence for cultural integration. Early Celtiberian cemeteries show burial practices that combine elements from both traditions. Celtic customs of weapon burial and cremation appear alongside Iberian practices of grave goods arrangement and memorial construction. The necropolis at Laosera, in use from the 6th century BC, contains cremation burials with grave goods that include both Celtic-style weapons and jewellery, and Iberian-style pottery and personal ornaments. Warrior burials from this period are particularly revealing. The tomb of a 6th century warrior at Caratiermes contained a Celtic-style iron sword with silver inlay, Iberian-made bronze belt fittings, and pottery vessels that combine elements from both traditions. The burial ritual itself follows Celtic practices, with the cremated remains placed in a ceramic urn surrounded by the deceased's weapons and personal possessions, yet the specific arrangement of grave goods and the construction of the burial chamber reflect Iberian funerary architecture. The development of Celtiberian material culture during the 8th through 6th centuries BC represents more than simple cultural borrowing or gradual assimilation. Instead, the archaeological record reveals a deliberate and sophisticated process of synthesis that created new forms and traditions while maintaining connections to both ancestral cultures. This process required not only peaceful coexistence, but active cooperation and intermarriage between Celtic migrants and Iberian populations over several generations. The success of this integration is evident in the rapid expansion of Celtiberian settlements during the 6th century BC. New sites appear throughout the Douro Basin and surrounding highlands, each displaying the characteristic material culture that had emerged from the Celtic-Iberian synthesis. These communities were not merely copying established patterns, but actively developing and refining the distinctive Celtiberian cultural complex that would define their civilization for centuries to come. Trade networks established during this period connected Celtiberian communities with both Celtic populations beyond the Pyrenees and Iberian societies along the Mediterranean coast. Amber beads from the Baltic, found in 6th century contexts at several Celtiberian sites, demonstrate connections to traditional Celtic trade routes, while Phoenician and Greek pottery fragments indicate participation in Mediterranean commercial networks established by Iberian intermediaries. The sophisticated cultural synthesis that emerged during the formative centuries of Celtiberian civilization provided the foundation for increasingly complex tribal confederations that would dominate the Central Iberian Plateau from the 6th through 3rd centuries BC. These confederations represented far more than simple military alliances, functioning as intricate political networks that balanced tribal autonomy with collective defence and economic cooperation. The Aravaci Confederation emerged as the most powerful of these tribal groupings, controlling vast territories centred on the Upper Douro Valley and extending eastward into the Sistema Iberico Mountains. Archaeological surveys have identified over 200 Aravaci settlements spanning from modern-day Soria to Burgos, with their principal stronghold at Numantia, commanding the Douro crossing near present-day Garay. The Aravaci territorial boundaries followed natural geographic features, with the Douro River serving as their southern frontier, while the Cordillera Iberica peaks marked their eastern limits. To the north, Aravaci influence extended into the foothills of the Montes de Oca, where fortified settlements like Uxama controlled strategic passes connecting the Meseta with the Ebro Valley. Excavations at Tiermes, another major Aravaci centre, have revealed the sophisticated urban planning that characterised their larger settlements. The site occupies a naturally defensible limestone plateau overlooking the Caracena Valley, with artificial terraces carved into the rock to create level areas for construction. Houses follow a standardised rectangular plan, measuring approximately 8 by 12 metres, with stone foundations supporting timber-framed upper walls and thatched roofs. Interior spaces were divided into distinct functional areas, with storage chambers cut directly into the bedrock and living areas arranged around central hearths lined with carefully fitted stone slabs. The Pelindons controlled territories immediately east of the Aravaci, centred on the headwaters of the Duero and extending into the high valleys of the Sistema Iberico. Their settlements clustered around defensible positions in the Moncayo Massif and the Urbion Peaks, with their primary centre at Contrebia Lucere near modern-day Inestrillas. The Pelindones specialised in high-altitude pastoralism and mining, exploiting rich iron ore deposits in the Demanda Mountains while maintaining extensive grazing grounds above the tree line. Their territorial boundaries with the Aravaci were marked by a series of fortified watchtowers built on prominent peaks, each positioned to provide visual communication with neighbouring installations. South of the Duero, the Belli Confederation occupied the rugged terrain between the river and the headwaters of the Tagus. Their territory encompassed the challenging landscape of the Alcaria Plateau and the eastern slopes of the Sistema Central, regions characterised by deep river gorges and isolated mesas that provided natural fortification. The Belli capital at Segeda, located near present-day Mara and Zaragoza province, controlled access routes between the Duero and Ebro basins while commanding extensive agricultural lands in the Jalon Valley. Archaeological investigation of Belli settlements reveals a preference for naturally fortified positions, with communities often built on isolated hills surrounded by steep-sided ravines that eliminated the need for extensive artificial defences. The Titi occupied a smaller but strategically crucial territory in the Upper Tagus Valley, controlling mountain passes that connected the central Meseta with the Mediterranean coastal regions. Their settlements concentrated around modern-day Molina de Aragon, where the Gallo River cuts through the Sistema Iberico to create natural corridors for trade and communication. Despite their limited territorial extent, the Titi wielded influence disproportionate to their size due to their control of these vital transportation routes. Their principal settlement at Sagontia commanded the junction of several ancient roads, with massive stone walls reinforcing the natural defences provided by the surrounding cliffs. The Lusones controlled the middle Ebro Valley and the southern slopes of the Sistema Iberico, with territories extending from the Moncayo Mountains eastward to the Maestrasco Highlands. Their capital at Contrebia Belaisca, identified with modern-day Botorita near Zaragoza, occupied a commanding position overlooking the Huerva Valley and the fertile plains surrounding the Ebro River. The Lusones developed the most sophisticated agricultural systems among the Celtiberian tribes, constructing elaborate irrigation networks that channeled mountain streams to water extensive grain fields in the valley bottoms. Aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed remnants of these ancient field systems, with stone-lined channels and distribution basins that demonstrate advanced hydraulic engineering. Within these tribal confederations, social organisation followed a complex hierarchical structure that reflected both Celtic traditions of warrior leadership and Iberian concepts of urban governance. At the apex stood the warrior elite, men who had distinguished themselves in battle and accumulated sufficient wealth to maintain extensive followings of armed retainers. These leaders lived in elaborate compounds within the fortified centres, occupying multi-room houses built around central courtyards and decorated with imported luxury goods that demonstrated their high status. Excavations at the elite quarter of Numantia have revealed the material culture associated with these warrior aristocrats. Houses in this district feature stone-paved courtyards surrounded by specialized rooms, including armories for weapon storage, workshops for metalworking, and reception halls for entertaining clients and allies. The largest of these compounds covers over 400 square meters, with walls constructed of carefully fitted ashlar masonry and roofs supported by carved wooden beams. Interior decorations include painted plaster walls featuring geometric patterns in red and black pigments, while floors consist of fitted stone slabs arranged in complex geometric designs. The warrior elite maintained their position through a combination of military prowess, economic control, and elaborate systems of personal obligation. Young men seeking advancement attached themselves to established leaders as clients, providing military service and labour in exchange for protection, equipment, and opportunities for advancement. These relationships, formalized through ritual ceremonies involving the exchange of weapons and oaths of loyalty, created networks of obligation that extended throughout Celtiberian society. Archaeological evidence for these clientage relationships appears in the form of weapon deposits found in elite residences. At Tiermas, excavation of a warrior's house, dating to the 4th century BC, revealed a cache of over 30 iron spearheads and sword blades stored in a specially constructed armory chamber. The weapons display varying degrees of wear and different manufacturing techniques, suggesting they were collected from multiple sources rather than produced as a single batch. This accumulation likely represents equipment provided to the warrior's followers, demonstrating the material basis of clientage relationships. Below the warrior elite, Celtiberian society included substantial populations of skilled craftsmen whose expertise in metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture provided the material foundation for tribal prosperity. These artisans occupied a privileged position within the social hierarchy, with their specialized knowledge conferring status and economic security. Workshops identified at major Celtiberian sites reveal the sophisticated organization of craft production, with evidence for standardized tools, specialized work areas, and quality control systems that ensured consistent output. The metalworking quarter at Contrebia Belasca provides exceptional insight into Celtiberian craft organization. The district contains over 20 workshops arranged along a single street, each equipped with multiple forges, anvils, and tool sets for different aspects of iron and bronze production. Slag heaps and ore processing areas indicate that craftsmen controlled the entire production sequence, from raw materials to finished products. Chemical analysis of metal artifacts from the site reveals sophisticated alloying techniques, with bronze compositions carefully adjusted for different applications, and iron weapons showing evidence of controlled carbon content to achieve optimal hardness and flexibility. Pottery workshops at the same site demonstrate similar organizational complexity. Production areas include specialized kilns for different firing temperatures, preparation areas for clay processing, and storage facilities for both raw materials and finished products. The pottery displays standardized forms and decorative schemes that suggest coordinated production systems, with individual workshops specializing in particular vessel types while maintaining overall stylistic consistency. Petrographic analysis of ceramic fabrics indicates that potters imported specific clay types from distant sources, demonstrating sophisticated supply networks and quality control systems. The agricultural foundation of Celtiberian society rested on communities of farmers who worked both individual plots and collective lands controlled by the tribal confederations. These farmers occupied small settlements scattered throughout the fertile valleys and upland plateaus, living in modest houses constructed of local stone and timber. Archaeological survey of rural areas has identified hundreds of these farming communities, each typically containing between 10 and 30 households, arranged around central areas used for grain processing and livestock management. Excavation of rural settlements reveals the material conditions of Celtiberian farmers. Houses follow standardized plans with living areas measuring approximately 6 by 8 meters, divided into spaces for human habitation and animal shelter during winter months. Storage facilities include both above-ground granaries and underground chambers carved into bedrock, designed to protect grain supplies from moisture and pests. Agricultural tools found at these sites include iron plowshares, sickles, and hoes that demonstrate advanced farming techniques adapted to the challenging conditions of the central Iberian plateau. The institution of clientage extended throughout rural communities, connecting farmers to warrior elites through networks of obligation and protection. Archaeological evidence for these relationships includes hoards of agricultural tools and weapons found buried at rural sites, likely representing equipment provided by patrons to their rural clients. The bronze plaque from Botorita, dating to the 1st century BC but reflecting earlier legal traditions, preserves detailed regulations governing client-patron relationships, including obligations for military service, agricultural labour, and tribute payments. Urban development during this period reflected the increasing complexity of Celtiberian society, with settlements evolving from simple hill forts into sophisticated proto-urban centres. The earliest Celtiberian settlements, dating to the 7th and 6th centuries BC, followed traditional Castro patterns with defensive walls, enclosing clusters of circular or oval houses arranged without formal planning. These hill forts typically occupied naturally defensible positions on elevated terrain, with artificial fortifications supplementing natural obstacles to create formidable defensive systems. The evolution toward more complex urban forms began during the 5th century BC, as increasing population and economic specialization required more sophisticated settlement organization. Sites like Numantia and Segeda developed formal street systems with rectangular blocks of houses arranged according to planned layouts. These proto-urban settlements featured specialized districts for different activities, with craft production areas separated from residential quarters and elite compounds occupying the most defensible positions within the fortified perimeters. Defensive systems evolved correspondingly, with simple stone walls giving way to complex fortifications featuring multiple lines of defense, towers, and elaborate gate systems. The walls of Numantia, reconstructed multiple times during the site's occupation, eventually reached heights of over 6 meters and incorporated advanced features, including projecting bastions, covered walkways, and concealed sally ports. Gate systems became particularly elaborate, with entrance passages designed to force attackers through multiple turns while exposing them to defensive fire from the walls above. Religious and ritual practices provided crucial mechanisms for social cohesion and cultural identity within Celtiberian communities. Warrior initiation ceremonies marked the transition from youth to adult status, involving ritual ordeals that tested physical courage and martial skills. Archaeological evidence for these practices includes specialized weapons found in sanctuary contexts, often deliberately damaged or killed, to remove them from secular use and dedicate them to divine powers. The sanctuary at Postoloboso has yielded extensive evidence for warrior initiation rituals. Votive deposits include hundreds of iron weapons, bronze belt fittings, and personal ornaments associated with young warriors. Many weapons show deliberate damage, with sword blades bent or broken and spearheads twisted beyond repair. These modifications appear to have been performed as part of ritual ceremonies rather than resulting from combat use, suggesting their role in religious observances connected to warrior initiation or dedication. Animal sacrifice played a central role in Celtiberian religious practice, with elaborate ceremonies conducted to ensure divine favour for military campaigns, agricultural seasons, and community welfare. Sanctuary sites throughout Celtiberian territory have produced extensive faunal remains from sacrificial activities, including complete skeletons of horses, cattle, and sheep arranged in ritual contexts. The bones often show evidence of careful butchering and preparation, with specific cuts and arrangements that suggest standardized ceremonial procedures. The cult of war deities occupied a particularly prominent position in Celtiberian religion, reflecting the martial character of their society and the constant threat of external conflict. Votive inscriptions identify several war gods, including Lugus, a deity associated with skill in combat and craftsmanship, and Mars, whose worship incorporated both Celtic and Roman elements during the later periods of Celtiberian independence. Sanctuary sites dedicated to these deities feature elaborate altar complexes and weapon deposits that demonstrate the central importance of divine favour in military affairs. The bronze plaques from various sanctuary sites preserve ritual formulae and religious regulations that governed ceremonial activities. These texts, written in the distinctive Celtiberian script, include detailed prescriptions for sacrifice procedures, festival calendars, and priestly obligations. The religious vocabulary preserved in these inscriptions demonstrates the sophisticated theological concepts developed by Celtiberian religious specialists, including complex ideas about divine intervention in human affairs and the proper procedures for ensuring supernatural protection. The material achievements of Celtiberian civilization reached their zenith between the 6th and 1st centuries BC, producing artifacts that combined technical mastery with distinctive artistic expression. Their metalworking traditions in particular established standards of excellence that impressed even Roman observers and influenced neighbouring cultures throughout the Western Mediterranean. The sophisticated techniques developed by Celtiberian smiths represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through guild systems that jealously guarded trade secrets while continuously refining production methods. Iron weapons form the cornerstone of Celtiberian metallurgical achievement, with swords that became legendary throughout the ancient world for their superior quality and distinctive appearance. The falcata, though more commonly associated with Iberian cultures, found its most refined expression in Celtiberian workshops where smiths adapted the curved blade design to incorporate Celtic hilting traditions and decorative motifs. These weapons featured single-edged blades that curved forward from straight hilts, with the cutting edge positioned on the concave side to concentrate striking force at the blade's tip. Celtiberian examples typically measured between 60 and 70 centimetres in total length, with blades forged from high-carbon steel that achieved hardness levels approaching modern specifications. The production process for these weapons involved sophisticated heat treatment techniques that required precise temperature control and timing. Smiths heated iron blanks in charcoal forges capable of reaching temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, then hammered the red-hot metal to achieve the characteristic blade profile while maintaining uniform thickness throughout the cutting edge. The most skilled craftsmen employed differential hardening techniques, heating only the blade edge to critical temperature before quenching in water or oil, leaving the spine softer and more flexible to prevent catastrophic failure under stress. Straight swords, following Celtic traditions but executed with superior Celtiberian techniques, represented another category of prestigious weapons. These double-edged blades typically measured between 70 and 90 centimetres in length, with parallel edges tapering to sharp points optimised for thrusting attacks. The tangs extended deep into wooden or bone grips wrapped with leather or cord for secure handling. Pattern welding, a technique involving the forge welding of iron and steel strips to create distinctive surface patterns, appeared on the most expensive examples, producing serpentine designs that seemed to writhe along the blade surfaces when viewed in flickering light. Spearheads demonstrated the full range of Celtiberian metalworking capabilities, From simple socketed points for everyday hunting to elaborate ceremonial weapons decorated with silver inlay and complex geometric patterns. Standard military spearheads featured leaf-shaped blades measuring 15 to 20 centimeters in length, with reinforced midribs that provided structural strength while minimizing weight. The sockets, formed by wrapping the heated iron around mandrels, achieved precise fits with wooden shafts while incorporating retention systems that prevented accidental separation during combat. The decorative treatment of weapons reflected both functional and aesthetic considerations. Silver wire inlay, a technique requiring exceptional skill, involved cutting narrow grooves into finished iron surfaces and hammering precious metal wire into these channels. The resulting patterns often incorporated Celtic spiral motifs, geometric designs derived from textile patterns, and occasionally figurative elements including stylized animals or human figures. These decorations served practical purposes beyond mere ornamentation, as the contrasting metals helped warriors identify their weapons in poor lighting conditions, while the raised patterns provided enhanced grip surfaces. Fibulae production represented another pinnacle of Celtiberian metalworking artistry, with regional workshops developing distinctive styles that combined functional excellence with sophisticated decorative programs. The characteristic meseta-type fibulae featured elongated catch plates decorated with intricate incised patterns that drew inspiration from both Celtic and Iberian artistic traditions. These bronze safety pins typically measured between 8 and 12 centimeters in length, with springs consisting of multiple coils that provided consistent tension for secure fastening. The manufacturing process for fibulae required precise control of bronze alloy composition, with craftsmen adjusting copper and tin ratios to achieve optimal working properties. The springs demanded particular attention, as improper alloy composition or heat treatment could result in brittle failures that rendered the entire piece useless. Master craftsmen developed specialized techniques for forming the coiled springs, using tapered mandrels to create uniform tension while ensuring proper alignment with the pin mechanisms. Decorative techniques employed on fibulae included engraving, repoussé work, and occasionally enamel inlays that added brilliant color accents to bronze surfaces. Engraved patterns followed established iconographic programs that conveyed information about the wearer's social status, tribal affiliation, and personal achievements. Geometric patterns predominated, with intricate combinations of spirals, chevrons, and interlaced designs that required exceptional skill to execute cleanly on curved bronze surfaces. Belt fittings and horse equipment represented additional categories of metalwork that demonstrated Celtiberian technical capabilities. Bronze belt plaques, worn by warriors and other high-status individuals, featured narrative scenes executed in the distinctive silhouette style characteristic of Iberian art. These rectangular plates, typically measuring 10 by 15 centimeters, depicted mounted warriors, hunting scenes, and ritual activities rendered with remarkable attention to detail despite the constraints of the medium. The production of these narrative plaques required sophisticated planning and execution techniques. Craftsmen first created detailed sketches on wax tablets, working out compositional arrangements and figural proportions before transferring the designs to bronze surfaces. The actual execution involved multiple techniques, including engraving for fine details, repoussé work for raised elements, and occasionally the application of contrasting metal inlays to emphasize specific features. Horse equipment, essential for the mounted warfare that characterized Celtiberian military tactics, received equally careful attention from metalworkers. Bronze bits featured elaborate cheek pieces decorated with animal heads, geometric patterns, and occasionally human figures that served both functional and apotropaic purposes. The bit rings, forged from iron for durability, incorporated bronze decorative elements that prevented corrosion while adding visual appeal. Harness fittings included an array of specialized components, including strap distributors, decorative pendants, and protective elements for vulnerable areas of horse anatomy. Many pieces featured hollow construction techniques that reduced weight without compromising strength, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of materials engineering principles. The decorative programs employed on horse equipment often matched those found on their riders' personal equipment, creating coordinated ensembles that proclaim the owner's status and aesthetic preferences. Agricultural practices throughout Celtiberian territory reflected careful adaptation to the challenging environmental conditions of the central Iberian plateau. The continental climate, characterized by harsh winters, hot dry summers, and limited precipitation, required farming strategies that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk. Cereal cultivation formed the foundation of agricultural production, with farmers developing specialized techniques for growing wheat, barley, and millet in the difficult conditions of the meseta. Wheat cultivation focused primarily on hardy varieties capable of surviving the temperature extremes and moisture limitations characteristic of the region. Archaeological analysis of carbonized grain samples from storage contexts reveals that Celtiberian farmers grew both emmer and einkorn wheat, ancient varieties that produced lower yields than modern cultivars, but demonstrated superior drought tolerance and resistance to fungal diseases. These wheats required careful timing of planting and harvesting operations, with farmers sowing seeds in late autumn to take advantage of winter moisture, while harvesting in early summer before the onset of severe drought conditions. Barley production concentrated on 6-row varieties that matured earlier than wheat and tolerated poor soil conditions more effectively. This crop served multiple purposes within Celtiberian agricultural systems, providing grain for human consumption, fodder for livestock, and raw materials for beer production. The shorter growing season required by barley made it particularly valuable as a security crop that could be harvested even in years when late spring frosts or early summer droughts damaged wheat harvests. Millet cultivation represented an important adaptation to the specific conditions of the Central Plateau. This drought-resistant grain required minimal inputs while producing reliable harvests even in marginal growing conditions. Celtiberian farmers typically planted millet in spring after the danger of frost had passed, allowing the crop to mature during the summer months when other cereals struggled with heat stress. The small seeds could be stored for extended periods without spoilage, providing crucial food security during difficult years. Field preparation techniques reflected sophisticated understanding of soil management and water conservation principles. Farmers employed iron plowshares attached to wooden plows, drawn by oxen to break up compacted soil layers and create furrows for seed placement. The timing of ploughing operations required careful attention to soil moisture conditions, with work typically conducted during brief periods when the soil contained sufficient moisture for effective cultivation, but not so much as to create compaction problems. Terracing systems developed on hillside locations demonstrated advanced engineering capabilities adapted to local topographic conditions. These stone-walled terraces, constructed without mortar using carefully fitted blocks, created level planting surfaces while preventing soil erosion during heavy rainfall events. The terrace walls incorporated drainage systems that channeled excess water to lower levels while retaining sufficient moisture for crop growth. Archaeological survey has identified extensive terrace systems throughout Celtiberian territory, with some installations covering hundreds of hectares of previously unusable slope terrain. Irrigation networks in valley locations utilized sophisticated water management techniques that maximized agricultural productivity while conserving scarce water resources. Stone-lined channels diverted water from seasonal streams and springs, distributing it through networks of smaller channels that could be controlled with wooden gates and stone weirs. These systems required coordinated maintenance efforts involving entire communities, with detailed regulations governing water rights and usage schedules preserved in legal documents like the Botorita Bronze. Storage systems for agricultural products reflected both the seasonal nature of harvest cycles and the need for long-term food security in an unpredictable climate. Underground storage chambers, carved directly into bedrock or constructed with stone walls and waterproof covers, maintained stable temperatures and humidity levels that prevented spoilage of grain supplies. These facilities, known as silos, featured sophisticated ventilation systems that prevented moisture accumulation while excluding rodents and insects. Above-ground granaries, constructed with raised floors and ventilated walls, provided additional storage capacity while allowing easier access to stored materials. These structures typically featured stone foundations that elevated wooden floors above ground moisture, with walls constructed of woven branches plastered with clay mixtures that provided protection from weather while allowing air circulation. Roof systems used locally available materials including stone slabs, wooden shingles, or thick layers of thatch depending on regional preferences and resource availability. Livestock management strategies integrated animal husbandry with crop production in sophisticated agricultural systems that maximized resource utilization while providing diverse food sources. Cattle served multiple functions, including draft power for ploughing operations, milk production for dairy products, and meat production for protein requirements. Celtiberian cattle breeds, adapted to local conditions through centuries of selective breeding, demonstrated exceptional hardiness and ability to survive on marginal pasture lands. Sheep flocks provided wool for textile production, milk for cheese making, and meat for consumption, while requiring minimal inputs beyond pasture access and protection from predators. The transhumant grazing patterns inherited from Celtic traditions allowed optimal utilization of seasonal pasture resources, with flocks moving to high mountain meadows during summer months and returning to protected valley locations for winter shelter. These migration patterns required extensive coordination between communities and detailed knowledge of pasture conditions, weather patterns, and predator behavior. Goat herds, particularly well adapted to the rocky terrain and sparse vegetation of marginal lands, provided additional protein sources while requiring minimal care and feeding. These hardy animals could survive on vegetation unsuitable for other livestock, effectively converting otherwise unusable plant materials into valuable food products. Goat milk, processed into various cheese types, provided important protein and fat sources during periods when other foods were scarce. Horse breeding represented a specialized aspect of Celtiberian animal husbandry that produced mounts renowned throughout the Mediterranean world for their speed, endurance, and intelligence. Archaeological evidence suggests that Celtiberian horse breeders maintained detailed knowledge of bloodlines and breeding practices, producing animals specifically adapted for mounted warfare. These horses, smaller than modern breeds but exceptionally hardy and agile, could survive on poor pasture while maintaining the energy and responsiveness required for combat operations. Swine management focused on breeds capable of foraging in oak forests and other woodland areas, converting acorns and other forest products into valuable protein sources. Pork provided important dietary variety while requiring minimal direct feeding, as pigs could subsist largely on forest resources unavailable to other domestic animals. The seasonal nature of acorn production required careful timing of breeding cycles to ensure maximum weight gain during periods of abundant forest resources. Pottery production throughout Celtiberian territory demonstrated the sophisticated synthesis of technical knowledge and artistic traditions that characterized their material culture. Regional workshops developed distinctive styles that combined Latena decorative motifs with indigenous Iberian ceramic traditions, creating vessels that served both functional and aesthetic purposes within daily life. The technical quality of Celtiberian ceramics reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge regarding clay preparation, forming techniques, and firing procedures adapted to local raw materials and environmental conditions. Clay preparation involved sophisticated processing techniques that ensured consistent working properties and fired strength. Potters selected clay sources based on mineral composition and plasticity characteristics, often mixing clays from different locations to achieve optimal working properties. Tempering materials, including crushed rock, sand, and organic additives, were carefully proportioned to prevent cracking during drying and firing while maintaining adequate plasticity for forming operations. Forming techniques included both wheel throwing and hand building methods, with different approaches employed for various vessel categories. Large storage jars utilized coil building techniques that allowed construction of vessels exceeding 1 meter in height, with walls thick enough to support substantial loads while maintaining structural integrity. Smaller vessels, including bowls, cups, and serving dishes, were typically formed on potter's wheels that allowed rapid production of standardized forms with consistent wall thickness and proportions. Decorative programs employed on Celtiberian pottery reflected the complex cultural synthesis that characterized their civilization. Geometric patterns derived from Latene artistic traditions appeared alongside motifs borrowed from Iberian decorative vocabularies, creating distinctive regional styles that proclaimed cultural identity while demonstrating technical virtuosity. Painted decorations utilized mineral pigments including iron oxides for red and brown colors, manganese compounds for black accents, and occasionally imported materials for special color effects. The application of painted decorations required precise timing and technique to achieve desired visual effects. Potters applied pigments to leather-hard clay surfaces using brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, creating patterns that ranged from simple geometric borders to complex narrative scenes. The firing process required careful temperature control to achieve proper pigment adhesion while preventing colour degradation or surface defects. Settlement architecture throughout Celtiberian territory reflected both defensive requirements and the social organisation of communities that balanced individual household needs with collective security concerns. The characteristic hilltop locations of major settlements provided natural defensive advantages while requiring sophisticated construction techniques adapted to challenging topographic conditions. Building materials utilized local stone resources supplemented with timber and clay products that could be obtained from surrounding areas. Circular stone houses represented the most distinctive architectural form developed by Celtiberian builders, combining Celtic structural traditions with construction techniques adapted to local materials and environmental conditions. These dwellings typically featured stone foundations extending below frostline depths, with walls constructed using carefully fitted blocks that required minimal mortar while providing excellent structural stability. Interior dimensions generally ranged between 4 and 8 meters in diameter, with floor areas sufficient for nuclear family groups, while remaining small enough to heat effectively during harsh winter conditions. The construction process for circular houses required sophisticated stoneworking techniques and careful attention to structural engineering principles. Builders selected foundation stones based on size and shape characteristics that provided stable bases for wall construction, often excavating foundation trenches to ensure level building surfaces. Wall construction proceeded using coursed masonry techniques that distributed loads evenly while accommodating the curved geometries required for circular plans. Roofing systems for circular houses utilized conical timber frameworks covered with thatch, stone slabs, or clay tiles depending on available materials and regional preferences. The central support systems required careful engineering to transfer roof loads to foundation elements, while providing adequate interior space for daily activities. Smoke holes at roof peaks allowed ventilation for central hearths, while incorporating weather protection systems that prevented rain infiltration. Interior arrangements within circular houses reflected both functional requirements and social customs governing family life and hospitality obligations. Central hearths, constructed with carefully fitted stone slabs and surrounded by raised edges to contain fires, provided heating and cooking facilities while serving as focal points for social activities. Storage areas, often built into wall thickness or excavated into floor surfaces, protected valuable possessions and food supplies while maximizing usable interior space. Rectangular houses, representing adaptations of Iberian architectural traditions to Celtiberian social requirements, appeared alongside circular structures in many settlements. These buildings typically featured stone foundations supporting timber-framed walls, with interior dimensions ranging from 6 by 8 meters to 10 by 15 meters for larger examples. The rectangular plan allowed more efficient space utilization while accommodating specialized activity areas, including workshops, storage chambers, and sleeping alcoves. Defensive walls surrounding Celtiberian settlements represented major engineering undertakings that required coordinated community efforts and sophisticated construction techniques. These fortifications typically followed natural terrain features while incorporating artificial elements that created formidable barriers against potential attackers. Wall construction utilized massive stone blocks fitted without mortar, creating structures that could withstand both natural weathering and deliberate assault attempts. The engineering principles employed in defensive wall construction reflected detailed understanding of structural mechanics and siege warfare techniques. Wall faces typically featured slight inward slopes that increased stability while presenting difficult climbing surfaces for attackers. Interior fill materials, including smaller stones and earth, provided mass and stability while allowing efficient use of available materials. Foundation systems extended well below surface levels to prevent undermining attacks while distributing structural loads across stable substrates. Gate systems represented the most sophisticated elements of Celtiberian fortification design, incorporating multiple defensive features that channeled attackers through controlled spaces while exposing them to defensive fire. Entrance passages typically featured multiple turns that prevented direct assault approaches, while incorporating chambers where defenders could position themselves to attack intruders from protected positions. Heavy wooden gates, reinforced with iron fittings and secured with massive wooden bars, provided final barriers that could withstand prolonged assault attempts. Communal spaces within fortified settlements served multiple functions, including markets, assembly areas, and religious centers that reinforced social cohesion while providing facilities for collective activities. These open areas, typically located near settlement centers and protected by surrounding buildings, featured stone-paved surfaces that could accommodate large gatherings while providing drainage during wet weather. Permanent installations, including altars, storage facilities, and workshop areas, supported various community functions, while demonstrating the sophisticated social organization that characterized Celtiberian settlements. The conclusion of the Second Punic War in 201 BC marked a decisive turning point in the relationship between Rome and the Iberian Peninsula. With Carthaginian power permanently broken and their territorial holdings transferred to Roman control, the Senate faced the complex task of consolidating authority over vast regions that had never experienced direct foreign domination. The coastal territories, already familiar with Carthaginian administration and Mediterranean trade networks, adapted relatively quickly to Roman oversight. The interior highlands, however, presented an entirely different challenge. Here, the Celtiberian confederations had maintained their independence for centuries, developing sophisticated political and military systems that would prove remarkably resistant to Roman expansion. Roman strategic planning for Iberian consolidation initially focused on securing the Mediterranean coastline and establishing reliable communication routes between the peninsula and Italy. The creation of the provinces of Hispania Citerior and Hispania Ulterior in 197 BC formalized Roman territorial claims while establishing administrative frameworks for governing conquered populations. These provincial boundaries, however, existed largely on paper when applied to the interior regions, where Celtiberian tribes continued to operate according to their traditional political structures. The appointment of Marcus Porcius Cato as praetor of Hispania Citeria in 195 BC demonstrated Roman determination to extend provincial authority into the interior highlands. Cato's brutal suppression of rebellion in the Ebro Valley and his systematic destruction of fortified settlements throughout northeastern Iberia served notice that Rome would not tolerate continued independence among indigenous populations. His campaigns, though successful in the short term, created lasting resentment among tribal populations while demonstrating the formidable military capabilities that awaited any group that challenged Roman authority. The Belli and Titi tribes occupied territories that placed them directly in the path of Roman expansion into the central Meseta. The Belli controlled the strategic Jalon Valley and the surrounding highlands, regions that commanded crucial routes between the Ebro Basin and the Upper Duero watershed. Their principal settlement at Segeda had grown into a substantial urban centre with sophisticated fortifications and a population estimated at over 10,000 inhabitants. The site's location near modern-day Mara provided natural defensive advantages while controlling access to mountain passes that connected the coastal provinces with the interior plateau. The Titi, though smaller in numbers, occupied equally strategic territory in the upper Tagus Valley, where their settlements controlled mountain corridors linking the central Meseta with Mediterranean coastal regions. Their fortified positions near present-day Molina de Aragon commanded ancient trade routes that had carried goods between interior and coastal populations for centuries. Roman control of these passes would effectively isolate the major Celtiberian confederations from potential allies while securing vital supply lines for future military operations. Roman demands for tribute from these tribes reflected broader imperial policies designed to extract wealth from conquered territories while demonstrating the practical benefits of submission. The tribute assessments imposed on the Belli and Titi included substantial quantities of grain, silver, and manufactured goods that would support Roman military operations while weakening tribal economic foundations. These demands far exceeded traditional tribute obligations that tribal populations had occasionally paid to more powerful neighbours, representing a fundamental alteration of political relationships that many Celtiberians found unacceptable. The tribute system also included requirements for military service that threatened to undermine traditional warrior culture and tribal military capabilities. Young Celtiberian men, previously devoted to developing martial skills within their own communities, would instead serve in Roman auxiliary units under foreign commanders pursuing Roman strategic objectives. This conscription not only deprived tribes of their most capable fighters, but also exposed Celtiberian warriors to Roman military techniques and organizational methods that could later be used against their own people. Initial resistance to Roman demands emerged gradually as tribal leaders assessed their options and consulted with allies throughout the Celtiberian confederations. The Belli and Titi had maintained close relationships with the more powerful Aravaci and Lusones tribes, creating networks of mutual obligation that complicated any decision to submit to Roman authority. Military assistance agreements, marriage alliances, and religious obligations created interconnected relationships that made isolated submission politically and culturally impossible. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals increased military preparation throughout Celtiberian territory, with weapon caches and defensive improvements appearing at settlements that had previously relied on their remote locations for security. At Segeda, excavations have revealed extensive modifications to the settlement's fortification system, including the construction of additional defensive walls and the reinforcement of gate structures with massive stone blocks. These improvements required coordinated community efforts, involving hundreds of workers over several construction seasons, demonstrating the seriousness with which tribal leaders viewed the Roman threat. The outbreak of open hostilities in 181 BC followed a pattern of escalating tensions and failed negotiations that characterized many Roman encounters with indigenous populations throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman demands for immediate tribute payments coincided with poor harvest conditions that left many communities struggling to meet their own subsistence needs. Tribal leaders, faced with impossible choices between starving their own people and defying Roman authority, chose resistance as the only viable option for maintaining their community's survival. The initial phases of the conflict revealed the fundamental differences between Roman and Celtiberian approaches to warfare. Roman military doctrine emphasized pitched battles between organized formations, with victory achieved through superior discipline, equipment, and tactical coordination. Roman legions, supported by auxiliary troops and siege equipment, sought to force decisive engagements where there are advantages in training and organization could determine outcomes quickly and efficiently. Celtiberian military traditions, by contrast, emphasize mobility, local knowledge, and the exploitation of terrain advantages that negated Roman superiority in formal battle. Tribal warriors, intimately familiar with every mountain pass, river crossing and defensive position throughout their territories, could appear suddenly to attack Roman supply columns before disappearing into landscapes where heavily equipped legions could not follow effectively. This guerrilla warfare approach, refined through centuries of intertribal conflict, proved remarkably effective against Roman forces accustomed to more conventional opponents. The weapons employed by Celtiberian warriors reflected their tactical preferences and the sophisticated metallurgical traditions that had developed throughout the Central Highlands. The straight double-edged swords favoured by tribal warriors typically measured between 70 and 85 centimetres in total length, with blades forged from high-carbon steel that achieved exceptional hardness through careful heat treatment. These weapons, designed for both cutting and thrusting attacks, proved devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat that characterized mountain warfare. The construction of these swords involved sophisticated forging techniques that produced blades superior to most Roman weapons of the period. Celtiberian smiths employed pattern welding methods that combined iron and steel strips to create blades with hard cutting edges supported by flexible spines that prevented catastrophic failure under stress. The distinctive serpentine patterns visible on blade surfaces resulted from the forge welding process, creating weapons that were both functionally superior and visually impressive symbols of warrior status. Curved daggers, typically measuring between 30 and 40 centimeters in length, served as secondary weapons and utility tools carried by virtually all Celtiberian warriors. These single-edged blades featured distinctive forward curves that concentrated cutting force at the blade tips while maintaining sufficient length for effective thrusting attacks. The hilts, constructed from wood, bone or antler and secured with bronze or iron fittings, provided secure grips even under wet or bloody conditions common in combat situations. The metallurgical quality of Celtiberian weapons impressed even Roman observers, who recognized the superior craftsmanship and materials that went into their production. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, noted that Celtiberian swords could cut through Roman shields and armour with ease, while their flexibility allowed them to bend without breaking under extreme stress. This technical superiority reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge and specialized production techniques that Roman armorsmiths had not yet mastered. Celtiberian warriors also employed an array of missile weapons that proved particularly effective in the mountainous terrain where much of the fighting occurred. Javelins, typically measuring between 2 and 3 meters in length, featured iron points designed to penetrate armor while remaining embedded in shields to render them unusable. The wooden shafts, carefully selected for straightness and balance, allowed accurate throwing at ranges up to 30 meters, while maintaining sufficient penetrating power to inflict serious wounds. Slings, constructed from leather or woven plant fibers, provided additional missile capability with ammunition that could be gathered from any rocky terrain. Skilled slingers could achieve remarkable accuracy at ranges exceeding 100 meters, launching stone projectiles with sufficient force to crack helmets or cause serious injuries to unprotected targets. The simplicity and portability of sling weapons made them ideal for guerrilla warfare, as warriors could carry substantial ammunition supplies without significant weight penalties. The tactical employment of these weapons reflected sophisticated understanding of combined arms principles adapted to irregular warfare conditions. Celtiberian warbands typically included balanced combinations of heavily armed warriors equipped for close combat, lighter troops specialized in missile attacks, and mounted fighters capable of rapid movement and pursuit operations. This tactical flexibility allowed tribal forces to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, while exploiting terrain advantages that negated Roman organizational superiority. Ambush tactics represented a particular specialty of Celtiberian warfare that proved devastatingly effective against Roman columns moving through mountain passes and river valleys. Warriors would position themselves on high ground overlooking narrow defiles, waiting for enemy forces to enter killing zones where escape routes were limited and defensive formations difficult to maintain. The initial attacks typically involved concentrated missile fire, designed to create confusion and casualties among enemy formations before close combat specialists moved in to complete the destruction. The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond their immediate tactical effects. Roman soldiers, accustomed to facing enemies in organized formations where courage and discipline could overcome numerical or positional disadvantages, found themselves confronting opponents who appeared and disappeared like phantoms while inflicting steady casualties through methods that seemed to violate accepted rules of warfare. The constant threat of ambush forced Roman commanders to adopt defensive postures that slowed their operations while consuming resources needed for offensive campaigns. Roman responses to Celtiberian tactics evolved gradually as commanders gained experience with mountain warfare and developed countermeasures adapted to local conditions. Increased use of auxiliary troops familiar with irregular warfare techniques provided better intelligence gathering capabilities while reducing the vulnerability of main force formations to surprise attacks. Light infantry units, recruited from allied populations with mountain warfare experience, proved more effective at pursuing Celtiberian raiders than heavily equipped legionaries encumbered with standard military equipment. The development of fortified camps at strategic locations throughout contested territory represented another Roman adaptation to Celtiberian tactical methods. These installations, constructed according to standard Roman engineering practices but adapted to local terrain conditions, provided secure bases for military operations while denying tribal forces access to key geographic positions. The camps typically featured multiple defensive lines, sophisticated water supply systems, and storage facilities capable of supporting garrison forces through extended siege conditions. Despite these adaptations, Roman forces continued to suffer significant casualties and operational setbacks throughout the initial phases of the conflict. The unfamiliar terrain, harsh climate conditions, and constant threat of attack created logistical challenges that strained Roman supply systems while exposing the limitations of military doctrines developed for Mediterranean warfare conditions. Supply columns required heavy escort forces that reduced the troops available for offensive operations, while the need to garrison captured positions further dispersed Roman strength across extensive territories. The first serious attempt at negotiated settlement emerged in 179 BC, following 3 years of inconclusive fighting that had exhausted both sides without producing decisive results. Roman casualties, though not catastrophic by imperial standards, had been sufficient to concern the Senate about the costs of continued military operations in regions that offered limited economic returns. The Celtiberian tribes, meanwhile, had suffered significant losses among their warrior populations, while experiencing economic disruption that threatened their community's long-term viability. The negotiations revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Roman imperial objectives and Celtiberian concepts of political autonomy. Roman negotiators, operating under Senate instructions to establish clear provincial authority throughout the contested regions, demanded tribute payments, military service obligations, and acceptance of Roman legal jurisdiction that effectively eliminated tribal independence. These terms, though presented as generous alternatives to continued warfare, represented cultural and political changes that many Celtiberian leaders found unacceptable. Tribal representatives speaking for communities that had never acknowledged foreign authority sought arrangements that would preserve their traditional governmental structures while establishing peaceful relationships with Roman provincial administration. Their proposals included mutual defense agreements, regulated trade relationships, and limited tribute obligations that recognized Roman supremacy without surrendering essential aspects of tribal autonomy. These terms, though reasonable from indigenous perspectives, failed to satisfy Roman requirements for clear administrative control and reliable resource extraction. The temporary peace agreements that emerged from these negotiations represented compromises that satisfied neither side's fundamental objectives, while providing breathing space for both parties to reassess their strategic positions. Roman forces withdrew from some advanced positions, while maintaining control of key transportation routes and strategic strongpoints. Celtiberian tribes agreed to suspend offensive operations while retaining control of their traditional territories and internal governmental structures. These arrangements established Roman influence throughout much of the contested territory without achieving the complete submission that imperial policy ultimately required. Tribal leaders acknowledged Roman supremacy in principle while maintaining practical independence in their internal affairs, creating ambiguous political relationships that would prove unstable over time. The tribute obligations included in the agreements remained modest compared to Roman demands in other provinces, reflecting the limited extent of actual Roman control over Celtiberian populations. The maintenance of tribal autonomy under these agreements allowed Celtiberian communities to preserve their traditional military organizations and weapon production capabilities. Warrior training continued according to established customs, while smiths maintained the specialized knowledge required for producing superior weapons and equipment. This preservation of military capabilities would prove crucial during later phases of the conflict when changed circumstances led to renewed hostilities between Roman and Celtiberian forces. The fragile peace established in 179 BC began to unravel almost immediately as Roman administrators struggled to implement the ambiguous terms of their agreements with Celtiberian tribal leaders. The fundamental contradictions between Roman imperial objectives and tribal concepts of autonomy created constant friction over territorial boundaries, tribute collection, and judicial authority. Roman officials, accustomed to clear hierarchical relationships in other provinces, found themselves dealing with complex networks of tribal obligations and traditional law systems that resisted integration into standard imperial administrative structures. The immediate catalyst for renewed hostilities emerged from seemingly minor disputes over territorial boundaries between the Belli and their neighbours, conflicts that had been managed through traditional arbitration mechanisms for centuries. Roman interference in these internal tribal affairs represented a dramatic departure from previous agreements, as provincial administrators attempted to impose Roman legal procedures on disputes that tribal leaders considered purely internal matters. The Belli leadership, already suspicious of Roman intentions, interpreted this intervention as evidence that Rome intended to gradually eliminate all aspects of tribal autonomy regardless of previous agreements. The specific trigger came when Roman surveyors began marking territorial boundaries according to their own understanding of the peace agreements, creating demarcation lines that ignored traditional grazing rights, sacred sites, and seasonal migration routes essential to Celtiberian pastoral economy. These arbitrary boundaries disrupted economic relationships that had functioned successfully for generations while demonstrating Roman ignorance of local conditions and customs. Tribal leaders found themselves unable to fulfill traditional obligations to their followers when Roman boundary markers blocked access to resources that communities had utilized since time immemorial. The situation deteriorated further when Roman tax collectors began demanding tribute payments that exceeded the modest levels specified in the peace agreements. These officials, operating under pressure from provincial governors to maximize revenue extraction, interpreted ambiguous treaty language in ways that dramatically increased tribal financial obligations. The belly, already struggling with poor harvests and disrupted trade relationships, found themselves facing tribute demands that threatened their community's basic survival, while funding Roman military operations against other indigenous populations. Roman interference in intertribal judicial proceedings represented another source of escalating tension that ultimately made peaceful coexistence impossible. Traditional Celtiberian law systems relied on complex arbitration procedures involving respected elders, religious authorities, and warrior leaders who understood tribal customs and precedents developed over centuries. Roman attempts to substitute their own legal procedures for these traditional systems created chaos in tribal governance while undermining the authority of indigenous leaders who had negotiated the original peace agreements. The construction of Segeda's expanded fortifications during this period reflected growing tribal awareness that renewed conflict was becoming inevitable. The settlement's leaders, recognizing that their strategic location made them a primary target for any Roman offensive, initiated massive construction projects designed to strengthen their defensive capabilities while demonstrating their determination to resist further Roman encroachment. The new walls, built using advanced engineering techniques developed through centuries of hilltop fortification experience, incorporated multiple defensive lines with sophisticated gate systems and artillery positions. These fortifications represented far more than simple military preparations. They embodied Celtiberian cultural values and political aspirations that Roman administrators failed to understand. The massive stone walls, constructed through coordinated community labor involving thousands of workers, demonstrated tribal unity and collective determination while creating physical symbols of resistance that inspired surrounding communities. The engineering sophistication displayed in these defensive works challenged Roman assumptions about indigenous technical capabilities while creating formidable obstacles to any future military operations. The expansion of Segeda itself became a point of contention when Roman officials declared that the construction of new urban areas violated treaty provisions limiting tribal military capabilities. The Romans interpreted the settlement's growth as evidence of aggressive intentions, failing to recognize that population increases reflected economic prosperity and successful agricultural development rather than military preparation. This misunderstanding revealed the fundamental cultural gap between Roman urban planning concepts and Celtiberian settlement patterns that had evolved to serve different social and economic functions. The forced relocation of Segeda's population in 153 BC represented the most dramatic escalation of Roman policy toward the Celtiberian tribes. Roman forces, operating under direct orders from the Senate, demanded that the entire settlement be abandoned and its inhabitants relocated to less defensible locations where they could be more easily controlled and monitored. This unprecedented demand violated every previous agreement, while threatening to destroy a community that had existed for centuries and served as a cultural and economic centre for the entire region. The logistics of this forced relocation reveal the scale of Roman military commitment to eliminating Celtiberian independence. The operation required substantial military forces to surround the settlement while preventing the escape of inhabitants who might join other tribal groups in renewed resistance. Roman engineers prepared alternative settlement sites that offered minimal defensive advantages while providing easy access for tax collectors and military patrols. The entire operation demonstrated Roman determination to reshape the political geography of central Iberia according to imperial strategic requirements. The belly response to these relocation demands galvanized resistance throughout the Celtiberian confederations. Tribal messengers carried news of Roman intentions to allied communities, triggering emergency assemblies where warrior leaders debated appropriate responses to this unprecedented threat. The forced abandonment of Segeda represented an assault on fundamental concepts of territorial sovereignty and cultural continuity that transcended immediate military considerations, transforming a local dispute into a broader struggle for Celtiberian survival. Carus emerged as the primary military leader, coordinating multi-tribal resistance efforts during this critical period. His background combined extensive combat experience from previous conflicts with diplomatic skills essential for managing complex alliance relationships among traditionally independent tribal groups. Archaeological evidence suggests that Carus came from the Belli aristocracy, with grave goods from elite burials of this period indicating wealth and status consistent with high tribal leadership positions. His ability to coordinate military operations across multiple tribal territories while maintaining unity among diverse groups demonstrated exceptional organizational capabilities. The military preparations coordinated under Carus's leadership represented the most sophisticated indigenous resistance effort that Romans had yet encountered in Iberia. Unlike previous tribal uprisings that relied primarily on local resources and traditional warfare methods, this coordinated response involved systematic planning, resource allocation, and strategic coordination that challenged Roman assumptions about indigenous military capabilities. Weapon production increased dramatically throughout Celtiberian territory, with smiths working continuously to equip expanded warrior forces while developing new tactical equipment adapted to anticipated Roman countermeasures. The coordination of intelligence networks represented another crucial aspect of Celtiberian military preparation that Roman commanders initially underestimated. Tribal communities throughout the Central Highlands maintained extensive communication systems based on signal fires, mounted messengers, and trusted intermediaries who could move freely through territories that remained largely unknown to Roman forces. These networks provided real-time information about Roman troop movements, supply operations, and strategic planning that allowed Celtiberian forces to anticipate enemy actions while coordinating their own responses effectively. The recruitment of warrior forces from multiple tribal groups required delicate negotiations that balanced traditional autonomy with military necessity. Each tribe maintained its own warrior traditions, weapon preferences, and tactical specializations that needed to be integrated into coordinated military operations without destroying the cultural identities that motivated tribal participation. Carus and other resistance leaders developed command structures that preserved tribal leadership roles while creating unified strategic direction, a complex organizational challenge that required exceptional diplomatic skills. The Roman military response under Quintus Fulvius Nobilior represented a significant escalation of imperial commitment to resolving the Celtiberian problem through decisive military action. Nobilior's appointment as consul specifically for Iberian operations demonstrated Senate recognition that the situation required the highest levels of military leadership and substantial resource commitments. His forces included not only veteran legions with extensive campaign experience, but also specialized auxiliary units recruited specifically for mountain warfare conditions. Nobilior's strategic approach emphasized rapid, decisive action designed to prevent the consolidation of tribal resistance while demonstrating Roman military superiority through overwhelming force. His operational planning called for simultaneous attacks on multiple tribal centers, preventing mutual support while forcing individual communities to surrender or face destruction. This strategy required careful coordination of multiple military columns operating across difficult terrain, while maintaining supply lines that stretched hundreds of kilometers from coastal bases. The siege equipment assembled for these operations represented the most advanced military technology available to Roman forces during this period. Catapults, ballistae, and siege towers constructed specifically for mountain warfare incorporated design modifications that increased their effectiveness against hilltop fortifications while remaining transportable across difficult terrain. Roman engineers developed specialized techniques for constructing these machines, using local materials when transportation from coastal bases proved impractical, demonstrating the technical sophistication that supported imperial military operations. The initial Roman assault on Segeda revealed both the strengths and limitations of conventional siege warfare when applied to Celtiberian fortifications. The settlement's defensive works, constructed using advanced indigenous engineering techniques, proved remarkably resistant to standard Roman siege methods. The multiple defensive lines forced attackers to overcome successive obstacles while exposing them to defensive fire from protected positions. The sophisticated gate systems channeled attacking forces through killing zones where defenders enjoyed overwhelming tactical advantages. Roman casualties during these initial assaults exceeded expectations, forcing Nobilior to modify his tactical approach while requesting additional reinforcements from provincial reserves. The superior quality of Celtiberian weapons became apparent as Roman armor and shields proved inadequate against indigenous steel weapons forged using advanced metallurgical techniques. The psychological impact of these early setbacks affected Roman morale while encouraging tribal resistance throughout the region. The prolonged siege operations required substantial logistical support that strained Roman supply systems while exposing the vulnerabilities of extended military operations in hostile territory. Supply columns required heavy escort forces that reduced the troops available for offensive operations, while the constant threat of tribal raids disrupted communication lines essential for coordinating multi-column operations. The harsh winter conditions of the Central Plateau created additional challenges for Roman forces accustomed to Mediterranean climate conditions. Marcus Claudius Marcellus assumed command of Roman operations following Nobilior's initial setbacks, bringing different strategic approaches based on his extensive experience with irregular warfare in other theatres. Marcellus recognized that conventional siege warfare alone would not achieve decisive results against opponents who could retreat to alternative strongholds while maintaining their military capabilities. His revised strategy emphasized cutting tribal supply lines and isolating individual communities while avoiding costly direct assaults on heavily fortified positions. The implementation of Marcellus's new approach required significant changes in Roman tactical methods and operational procedures. Increased use of auxiliary troops familiar with mountain warfare provided better intelligence gathering capabilities while reducing the vulnerability of main force formations to surprise attacks. Light infantry units proved more effective at pursuing tribal raiders than heavily equipped legionaries, while mounted forces provided the mobility necessary for rapid response to changing tactical situations. The establishment of fortified camps at strategic locations throughout contested territory represented a crucial element of Marcellus's revised strategy. These installations provided secure bases for military operations, while denying tribal forces access to key geographic positions. The camps incorporated sophisticated defensive features adapted to local terrain conditions, while maintaining the standardized layouts that facilitated rapid construction and efficient operation. Supply depots within these fortifications reduced the vulnerability of Roman logistics while providing staging areas for offensive operations. Despite these tactical modifications, Roman forces continued to face significant challenges from Celtiberian resistance strategies that exploited every advantage provided by terrain, climate, and local knowledge. Tribal forces avoided pitched battles where Roman organizational advantages could prove decisive, instead conducting constant harassment operations that inflicted steady casualties while disrupting enemy operations. The superior quality of Celtiberian weapons continued to surprise Roman commanders who had underestimated indigenous metallurgical capabilities. The economic impact of prolonged warfare began affecting both sides as military operations disrupted normal agricultural and commercial activities throughout the contested regions. Roman supply requirements strained provincial resources, while the costs of maintaining large military forces in remote locations exceeded initial budget projections. Celtiberian communities faced similar pressures as warrior casualties reduced agricultural labour while military demands consumed resources needed for normal subsistence activities. The diplomatic dimensions of the conflict became increasingly complex as other indigenous populations throughout Iberia assessed the implications of Roman victory or defeat in the Central Highlands. Some tribal groups sought accommodation with Roman authorities, hoping to avoid similar military pressure through voluntary submission and cooperation. Others prepared their own defensive measures while monitoring the progress of Celtiberian resistance efforts, recognizing that the outcome would determine the future of indigenous independence throughout the peninsula. By 143 BC, the strategic landscape of the Celtiberian Wars had crystallized around Numantia, the hilltop stronghold that commanded the upper Duero Valley from its commanding position near present-day Garay. The settlement had evolved far beyond its origins as a simple castro, developing into a sophisticated urban centre that served as the political and military nerve centre of Aravaci resistance to Roman expansion. Archaeological investigations have revealed the extent of Numantia's fortifications during this period, with defensive walls that incorporated multiple construction phases reflecting decades of continuous improvement and expansion. The site's natural advantages made it perhaps the most formidable defensive position in all of Celtiberian territory. The settlement occupied a triangular plateau rising approximately 40 metres above the surrounding Duero Valley, with steep slopes on three sides that rendered conventional assault approaches extremely difficult. The narrow neck of land connecting the plateau to the surrounding highlands provided the only practical access route, a geographic bottleneck that Numantian engineers had fortified with massive stone walls and elaborate gate systems that channeled attackers through carefully prepared killing zones. The urban layout within Numantia's walls reflected sophisticated planning principles, adapted to both defensive requirements and the social organisation of Celtiberian society. Streets followed the natural contours of the plateau, while providing clear sightlines for defenders monitoring potential approach routes. Houses clustered in distinct neighbourhoods that corresponded to different tribal affiliations and social groups, with elite compounds occupying the most protected central areas, while craftsmen's workshops lined the defensive perimeter, where their activities could contribute directly to military preparations. The population of Numantia during the siege period has been estimated at approximately 8,000 inhabitants, based on the density of residential structures identified through archaeological survey. This figure included not only permanent residents, but also refugees from surrounding communities that had been overrun by Roman forces during previous campaigns. The concentration of population within the fortified perimeter created logistical challenges for food storage and water supply while providing the human resources necessary for maintaining sophisticated defensive systems under prolonged siege conditions. Water supply represented a crucial vulnerability that Numantian engineers had addressed through sophisticated hydraulic systems that captured and stored precipitation while providing access to underground springs. Stone-lined cisterns carved into the bedrock beneath the settlement could store sufficient water for the entire population during extended dry periods, while carefully concealed wells provided alternative sources that remained hidden from besieging forces. These water management systems incorporated overflow channels and filtration mechanisms that maintained water quality while preventing contamination during siege conditions. Food storage facilities within Numantia reflected the community's awareness that prolonged siege was a likely scenario requiring extensive preparation. Underground granaries carved into the bedrock provided climate-controlled storage for grain supplies while remaining invisible to enemy observers. These facilities incorporated sophisticated ventilation systems that prevented spoilage while excluding rodents and insects that could destroy stored provisions. Above-ground storage buildings featured raised floors and ventilated walls that protected perishable goods while allowing easy access for distribution during emergency conditions. The weapons production capabilities maintained within Numantia's walls represented perhaps the most sophisticated metallurgical operation in all of Celtiberian territory. Archaeological excavations have identified multiple smithing workshops equipped with advanced furnaces capable of achieving the high temperatures required for steel production. These facilities included specialized areas for different aspects of weapon manufacture, from initial forging operations through final finishing and decoration. The concentration of metallurgical expertise within the settlement allowed continuous weapon production even under siege conditions, while maintaining the quality standards that made Celtiberian arms legendary throughout the Mediterranean world. The appointment of Quintus Pompeius as consul for Hispania Citeria in 141 BC marked the beginning of systematic Roman efforts to reduce Numantia through conventional siege warfare. Pompeius brought extensive military experience from previous campaigns in Greece and Asia Minor, along with siege equipment specifically designed for reducing heavily fortified positions. His forces included veteran legions with proven combat records, supplemented by auxiliary units recruited from allied populations familiar with Iberian warfare conditions. Pompeius's initial strategic assessment recognized that direct assault against Numantia's formidable defenses would result in catastrophic casualties while offering minimal prospects for success. The steep approaches to the settlement's walls eliminated the possibility of using standard Roman siege techniques, while the sophisticated defensive works incorporated features specifically designed to counter conventional Roman military methods. Instead, Pompeius opted for a blockade strategy intended to starve the defenders into submission, while avoiding costly frontal attacks against prepared positions. The establishment of Roman siege lines around Numantia required extensive engineering work adapted to the challenging terrain surrounding the settlement. Roman engineers constructed fortified camps at strategic positions that commanded the main approach routes, while remaining beyond the effective range of defensive artillery. These installations incorporated standard Roman defensive features, including ditches, palisades, and watchtowers, while adapting to local topographic conditions that limited the application of standardized construction techniques. The logistics of maintaining Roman forces in siege positions around Numantia created substantial challenges that strained imperial supply systems throughout the region. The remote location of the settlement required supply columns to traverse hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, while carrying sufficient provisions for thousands of troops operating in a landscape that offered minimal local resources. Roman engineers constructed fortified supply depots at regular intervals along the main approach routes, creating a network of installations that protected vital logistics while providing staging areas for reinforcement operations. Celtiberian responses to Roman siege tactics demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking that had developed within the tribal confederations during decades of conflict with imperial forces. Numantian commanders recognized that passive defense would ultimately result in defeat through starvation, regardless of their fortification strength. Instead, they implemented active defense strategies that combined sorties against Roman positions with efforts to maintain communication and supply lines with allied communities throughout the surrounding region. The quality of weapons employed by Numantian defenders during these operations continued to surprise Roman observers who had underestimated Celtiberian metallurgical capabilities. Swords forged within the settlement's workshops demonstrated technical sophistication that exceeded most Roman military equipment, with blade construction that combined exceptional hardness at cutting edges with flexible spines that prevented catastrophic failure under combat stress. The distinctive pattern welding techniques employed by Numantian smiths created weapons that were both functionally superior and visually impressive symbols of cultural identity and resistance. Missile weapons played crucial roles in the defensive operations conducted from Numantia's walls. The settlement's elevated position provided ideal conditions for archery and slinging operations that could reach Roman positions while remaining protected from return fire. Celtiberian archers employed composite bows constructed from horn, wood, and sinew that achieved superior range and penetrating power compared to simple wooden bows used by most Roman auxiliary troops. The arrows featured iron points designed to penetrate Roman armour while remaining embedded in shields to reduce their defensive effectiveness. Sling warfare represented another Celtiberian specialty that proved devastatingly effective during siege operations. The rocky terrain surrounding Numantia provided unlimited supplies of projectiles that skilled slingers could launch with remarkable accuracy at ranges exceeding 100 meters. Lead bullets, cast in standardized molds within the settlement's workshops, achieved superior ballistic performance while conserving stone ammunition for extended operations. Some lead projectiles bore inscribed messages or symbols that served both practical identification purposes and psychological warfare functions designed to demoralize enemy forces. The failure of Pompeius's initial siege efforts became apparent as months passed, without significant progress toward reducing Numantian resistance. Roman casualties from constant harassment operations mounted steadily while supply difficulties created morale problems among troops unaccustomed to prolonged static operations in hostile territory. The superior quality of Celtiberian weapons became a persistent source of concern as Roman equipment proved inadequate for countering indigenous military technology developed through centuries of specialized production. Quintus Caecilius Metellus assumed command of Roman operations in 142 BC, bringing different strategic approaches based on his reputation for methodical planning and systematic execution. Metellus recognized that previous commanders had underestimated both the defensive capabilities of Numantia's fortifications and the determination of its defenders to resist Roman authority, regardless of the costs involved. His revised approach emphasized cutting all external support for the besieged settlement while developing new siege techniques specifically adapted to the unique challenges presented by the site's geography. The engineering projects initiated under Metellus's command represented significant advances in Roman siege warfare technology adapted to mountain conditions. Siege towers constructed specifically for operations against Numantia incorporated design modifications that allowed them to function effectively on steep terrain while providing protection for assault troops approaching the settlement's walls. These structures featured reinforced foundations that could maintain stability on irregular ground, while supporting the weight of artillery equipment and assault ramps needed for scaling operations. Catapult batteries positioned around Numantia's perimeter provided sustained bombardment capabilities that gradually degraded the settlement's defensive works while creating psychological pressure on the defenders. Roman engineers developed specialized projectiles designed for different tactical purposes, including incendiary devices intended to start fires within the settlement and heavy stone balls that could breach defensive walls through repeated impacts. The systematic nature of these bombardments reflected Metellus' methodical approach to reducing enemy capabilities through sustained pressure rather than dramatic single actions. The construction of approachworks represented another innovation in Roman siege techniques developed specifically for the Numantian operation. Engineers built protected corridors that allowed assault troops to advance within striking distance of the settlement's walls while remaining shielded from defensive fire. These structures incorporated timber frameworks covered with hides and earth that provided protection from arrows and sling stones, while supporting the weight of soil and stone used for additional reinforcement. Counter-siege operations conducted by Numantian defenders demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that had developed within Celtiberian communities during decades of conflict with Roman forces. Defensive engineers constructed underground tunnels that allowed sorties against Roman siege works while providing concealed access to water sources outside the settlement's walls. These tunnels incorporated sophisticated support systems and ventilation arrangements that allowed their use even during extended siege conditions. The mining and countermining operations that developed during Metellus' siege represented some of the most technically advanced military engineering of the ancient world. Roman engineers attempted to undermine sections of Numantia's walls by digging tunnels beneath the foundations and then collapsing them through controlled fires or structural demolition. Numantian counterminers detected these operations through acoustic methods and constructed their own tunnels to intercept Roman efforts, while creating opportunities for underground combat in confined spaces where individual skill could overcome numerical disadvantages. The psychological dimensions of the siege became increasingly important as both sides recognized that morale and determination would ultimately prove more decisive than purely military factors. Roman forces, despite their superior numbers and equipment, faced constant harassment that prevented rest and created persistent anxiety about sudden attacks. The isolation of their position, surrounded by hostile territory with tenuous supply lines, contributed to morale problems that affected combat effectiveness and discipline. Numantian defenders, while facing the prospect of eventual starvation, maintained high morale through their confidence in their weapons, fortifications, and leadership. The successful resistance against previous Roman commanders had created a sense of invincibility that sustained community cohesion even under increasingly difficult conditions. Religious ceremonies and warrior traditions provided cultural frameworks for understanding their struggle in terms that transcended immediate military considerations, transforming the siege into a sacred obligation that demanded sacrifice regardless of personal costs. The appointment of Scipio Aemilianus as consul specifically for the Numantian campaign in 134 BC represented Roman recognition that conventional siege methods had failed to achieve decisive results against this particular opponent. Scipio's reputation as the conqueror of Carthage brought prestige and resources that previous commanders had lacked, while his proven ability to reduce heavily fortified positions through systematic approaches offered hope for finally resolving the Celtiberian problem through military means. Scipio's strategic analysis of the Numantian situation led him to conclude that previous Roman efforts had failed because they attempted to achieve quick results through methods that played to Celtiberian defensive strengths. His revised approach emphasized complete isolation of the settlement through comprehensive blockade operations that would prevent any external support while systematically degrading defensive capabilities through sustained pressure. This strategy required substantially larger forces and extended time commitments, but offered greater prospects for decisive success. The construction of circumvallation works around Numantia represented the most ambitious siege engineering project undertaken by Roman forces during the Celtiberian Wars. These fortifications created a complete ring of defensive positions that prevented any communication between the besieged settlement and potential allies throughout the surrounding region. The earthworks incorporated sophisticated design features, including multiple defensive lines, artillery positions, and supply routes that allowed Roman forces to maintain their positions indefinitely while gradually tightening their control over the besieged population. The scale of these construction projects required coordinated efforts involving thousands of workers over several months of intensive labour. Roman engineers surveyed the entire perimeter around Numantia to identify optimal positions for defensive installations while ensuring complete coverage of all potential escape routes. The resulting fortifications extended for over 9 kilometres in total length, incorporating natural terrain features while adding artificial obstacles that created formidable barriers against any attempts to break the blockade from either direction. The fall of Numantia in 133 BC marks not merely the end of organised Celtiberian military resistance, but the beginning of a profound transformation that would reshape the cultural landscape of central Iberia over the following century. The systematic destruction of the settlement and the enslavement or execution of its defenders sent an unmistakable message throughout the highlands. Continued resistance to Roman authority would result in complete annihilation. Yet the Roman response to victory revealed a pragmatic understanding that military conquest alone could not secure lasting control over populations whose warrior traditions and territorial knowledge made them potentially valuable allies if properly integrated into imperial structures. The administrative integration of former Celtiberian territories into the provincial system of Hispania Caeteria proceeded gradually, reflecting Roman recognition that hasty implementation of foreign governmental structures could provoke renewed rebellion among populations still mourning their recent defeats. Provincial governors appointed during the 130s and 120s BC focused initially on establishing Roman presence in strategic locations, while allowing traditional tribal leadership structures to continue functioning under imperial oversight. This approach required careful balancing of Roman administrative requirements with indigenous political customs that had governed these communities for centuries. The delineation of territorial boundaries within the new provincial framework created immediate challenges as Roman surveyors attempted to impose geometric precision on landscapes where traditional boundaries followed seasonal migration routes, watershed divisions, and sacred sites that held deep cultural significance for local populations. The centuriation system employed throughout other Roman territories proved particularly difficult to implement in the mountainous terrain of the central Meseta, where irregular topography and established settlement patterns resisted the standardized grid layouts that facilitated tax collection and land distribution in flatter regions. Roman administrators discovered that effective governance required detailed understanding of existing social hierarchies and economic relationships that connected communities across vast territories through networks of kinship, clientage, and mutual obligation. The tribal confederations that had coordinated military resistance possessed sophisticated political structures that could be adapted to serve imperial administrative purposes if properly understood and carefully modified. Rather than destroying these systems entirely, pragmatic governors began incorporating traditional leaders into Roman administrative hierarchies, while gradually introducing imperial legal procedures and fiscal obligations. The establishment of Roman legal jurisdiction throughout former Celtiberian territories represented one of the most significant challenges facing provincial administrators during this period. Indigenous legal traditions relied heavily on oral precedents, customary procedures, and community consensus mechanisms that differed fundamentally from Roman written law codes and formal court procedures. The resolution of disputes involving property rights, inheritance claims, and commercial agreements required careful negotiation between Roman legal principles and tribal customs that local populations understood and accepted as legitimate. Roman law's emphasis on individual property rights created particular difficulties in regions where communal ownership patterns governed access to grazing lands, water sources, and mineral deposits that entire communities had utilized for generations. The conversion of these traditional use rights into individual ownership titles required extensive surveying operations and legal documentation that often ignored the complex seasonal and ceremonial obligations that had regulated resource utilization under indigenous systems. These changes frequently created conflicts between community members who found their traditional access rights suddenly restricted by newly established property boundaries. The gradual introduction of Roman commercial law facilitated increased trade between former Celtiberian communities and Mediterranean markets, but also disrupted traditional exchange relationships that had maintained economic balance among highland populations. Roman emphasis on monetary transactions and standardized weights and measures replaced barter systems and customary exchange rates that had evolved to accommodate seasonal variations in agricultural production and pastoral activities. Local populations required time to adapt to these new commercial practices while learning to navigate legal procedures that governed contracts, debt collection, and dispute resolution under Roman jurisdiction. Urban planning initiatives undertaken in former Celtiberian settlements during the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC reflected Roman attempts to transform traditional hilltop fortifications into administrative centres that could serve imperial governmental functions while accommodating local populations accustomed to different architectural styles and spatial arrangements. The rectangular grid patterns favoured by Roman planners often conflicted with the organic growth patterns of indigenous settlements that had developed around natural terrain features and defensive requirements over many generations. The reconstruction of Numantia beginning in the 120 SBC provided the most dramatic example of Roman urban planning principles applied to a site with profound cultural significance for local populations. Roman engineers levelled much of the original settlement's irregular street system, replacing it with orthogonal layouts that facilitated administrative functions while symbolically demonstrating imperial control over spaces that had previously embodied Celtiberian independence. The new forum complex occupied the central plateau area, where traditional assembly spaces had hosted tribal councils and religious ceremonies for centuries. Architectural styles introduced during this reconstruction phase combined Roman structural techniques with decorative elements that acknowledged local artistic traditions and building practices. Stonemasonry work incorporated indigenous techniques for fitting irregular blocks while adopting Roman methods for creating level foundations and standardized wall heights. Roofing systems utilized local materials, including stone slabs and timber framing, while incorporating Roman innovations such as ceramic tiles and improved drainage systems that enhanced durability and weather resistance. Residential architecture evolved gradually as local populations adapted Roman house plans to accommodate traditional family structures and social customs that differed from Mediterranean urban practices. The atrium-style houses favoured by Roman colonists required modifications to function effectively in the harsh continental climate of the Central Plateau, where winter temperatures and summer heat extremes demanded different approaches to interior heating and ventilation. Local builders developed hybrid architectural forms that combined Roman spatial organisation with indigenous techniques for climate control and structural stability. Public buildings constructed during this period served dual functions as symbols of Roman authority and practical facilities for administrative operations that required local participation and acceptance. Basilicas designed for legal proceedings incorporated traditional assembly spaces where community leaders could participate in judicial processes while maintaining some connection to indigenous decision-making customs. Bath complexes introduced Roman hygiene practices while providing social gathering spaces that gradually replaced traditional meeting areas associated with pre-conquest political structures. Religious transformation throughout former Celtiberian territories proceeded more slowly than administrative or architectural changes, reflecting the deep cultural significance of indigenous spiritual practices and the Roman policy of religious tolerance that allowed local deities to continue receiving worship alongside newly introduced imperial cults. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites throughout the region reveals the gradual syncretization of Celtic and Roman religious elements during the 1st century BC, with traditional Celtiberian deities receiving Roman names and attributes while maintaining their essential characteristics and ceremonial requirements. The cult of Lugus, the Celtic deity associated with craftsmanship and warrior skills, underwent particular transformation as Roman administrators recognized the god's importance to local populations while seeking to incorporate his worship into imperial religious frameworks. Inscriptions from this period show Lugus receiving the Roman name Mercury, while retaining distinctively Celtic attributes and ceremonial practices that connected him to traditional Celtiberian cultural values. Sanctuary sites dedicated to this deity continued operating under Roman oversight, while gradually adopting architectural features and ritual practices derived from Roman religious traditions. Mars worship among former Celtiberian populations demonstrated similar syncretic development as local war deities merged with Roman military religious practices. The indigenous emphasis on warrior initiation ceremonies and weapon consecration rituals found expression within Roman military cult practices that honoured Mars as protector of soldiers and guarantor of victory. Votive deposits from sanctuary sites show traditional Celtiberian weapons and military equipment being dedicated according to Roman ceremonial procedures, while maintaining indigenous symbolic meanings and cultural associations. The introduction of imperial cult worship represented a more dramatic innovation that required careful adaptation to local political and religious sensibilities. The deification of Roman emperors and the requirement for public ceremonies honouring imperial achievements created obligations that had no precedent in Celtiberian religious traditions. Local populations gradually incorporated these new ceremonial requirements into existing festival calendars while maintaining traditional celebrations that honoured indigenous deities and seasonal cycles important to agricultural and pastoral activities. Religious architecture evolved to accommodate these syncretic practices through the construction of temples that combined Roman structural principles with decorative elements and spatial arrangements that reflected local spiritual traditions. Temple complexes built during the 1st century BC typically featured Roman-style colonnades and formal altar arrangements, while incorporating sacred groves, water features, and orientation patterns that acknowledged indigenous religious requirements. These hybrid architectural forms created spaces where traditional and imperial religious practices could coexist, while gradually evolving towards more thoroughly Romanized ceremonial programs. Economic transformation throughout former Celtiberian territories accelerated dramatically during the 1st century BC as Roman mining operations expanded to exploit the region's substantial mineral resources. The silver deposits of the Sierra Morena and the Sistema Central had been worked on a limited scale by indigenous populations for centuries, but Roman engineering capabilities and organizational methods enabled extraction operations of unprecedented scale and efficiency. These mining activities created new economic opportunities while fundamentally altering traditional relationships between communities and their natural environments. The silver mines at Carthago Nova became the primary focus of Roman extraction efforts, with engineering projects that included extensive underground workings, sophisticated drainage systems, and processing facilities capable of handling massive quantities of ore. The labour requirements for these operations drew workers from throughout the former Celtiberian territories, creating new patterns of seasonal migration and permanent relocation that disrupted traditional community structures, while providing economic opportunities for populations struggling to adapt to post-conquest conditions. Mining operations required substantial infrastructure development, including roads, aqueducts, and processing facilities that connected remote extraction sites with transportation networks capable of moving finished products to Mediterranean markets. Roman engineers constructed elaborate systems of galleries, shafts, and drainage tunnels that penetrated deep into mountainsides while maintaining safe working conditions and efficient ore extraction procedures. These projects demonstrated Roman technical capabilities while creating permanent alterations to landscapes that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The social impact of mining operations extended far beyond the immediate workforce, as entire communities became economically dependent on extraction activities that operated according to Roman production schedules and market demands rather than traditional seasonal cycles. Agricultural communities found themselves supplying food and materials to mining settlements while adapting their production patterns to serve markets that operated according to imperial rather than local requirements. These changes created new forms of economic interdependence while weakening traditional subsistence strategies that had provided security during periods of environmental stress or political disruption. Lead extraction operations in the Cantabrian Mountains and other highland regions provided additional economic opportunities while requiring different technical approaches adapted to local geological conditions. Roman engineers developed specialized techniques for processing lead ores while creating transportation systems that could move heavy metal products across difficult mountain terrain to coastal shipping facilities. These operations employed substantial numbers of local workers while introducing new technologies and production methods that gradually influenced other aspects of regional economic activity. The monetization of economic relationships throughout former Celtiberian territories accompanied the expansion of mining operations, as Roman administrators sought to integrate local populations into imperial fiscal systems that relied on standardized currency and taxation procedures. Traditional barter relationships and customary exchange rates gave way to monetary transactions that required local populations to acquire Roman coins while learning to navigate commercial practices that differed significantly from indigenous economic customs. Roman currency circulation patterns reveal the gradual penetration of monetized exchange relationships into highland communities that had previously operated according to gift economies and reciprocal obligation systems. Archaeological deposits from settlement sites show increasing quantities of Roman coins appearing in contexts that suggest their use for local transactions rather than merely as stores of value or symbols of Roman political authority. This transition required substantial cultural adaptation as communities learned to assign monetary values to goods and services that had previously been exchanged according to social relationships and ceremonial obligations. Tax collection procedures implemented throughout the region required local populations to generate cash income sufficient to meet Roman fiscal obligations while maintaining traditional subsistence activities essential for community survival. This dual economic burden created pressures that forced many communities to participate in market activities that connected them to Mediterranean commercial networks, while potentially undermining traditional economic strategies that had provided stability during periods of environmental or political stress. The transformation of economic relationships throughout former Celtiberian territories created new contexts for written communication that preserved indigenous linguistic traditions while adapting them to Roman administrative requirements. The bronze tablets discovered at Botorita represent the most substantial corpus of Celtiberian writing, providing unprecedented insight into the administrative vocabulary and legal concepts that developed during the transition from tribal governance to Roman provincial administration. The longest of these inscriptions, known as Botorita I, contains over 200 words arranged in 11 lines of text that reveal sophisticated legal terminology adapted from Celtic linguistic roots to express concepts required for Roman-style governmental procedures. The script system employed in these inscriptions demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of Celtiberian intellectual culture, as indigenous scribes modified the Iberian writing system to accommodate the phonological requirements of their Celtic language. The Iberian script, fundamentally syllabic in structure, required extensive adaptation to represent the consonant clusters and vowel sequences characteristic of Celtic languages. Celtiberian scribes developed innovative solutions, including the creation of new symbols for sounds that did not exist in Iberian, while establishing consistent orthographic conventions that allowed accurate representation of their spoken language in written form. The administrative vocabulary preserved in the Botorita inscriptions reveals the extent to which Celtiberian communities had developed sophisticated governmental institutions that combine traditional tribal concepts with administrative practices required for interaction with Roman provincial authorities. Terms relating to territorial boundaries, legal procedures, and fiscal obligations appear alongside vocabulary derived from Celtic roots that express concepts of communal responsibility and collective decision-making. This linguistic evidence demonstrates that Romanization proceeded through adaptation rather than replacement, with indigenous institutions evolving to meet new requirements while maintaining essential cultural characteristics. Personal names appearing throughout Celtiberian inscriptions from this period illustrate the complex processes of cultural negotiation that occurred within individual families and communities as they adapted to Roman social expectations while preserving connections to ancestral identities. The onomastic evidence reveals patterns of name selection that balance Roman citizenship requirements with Celtic linguistic traditions and family heritage considerations. Many individuals bore hybrid names that combined Roman praenomina and gentilicia with Celtic cognomina that preserved tribal affiliations and ancestral connections important for maintaining social relationships within indigenous communities. The bronze tablet from Lusaga provides additional evidence for the persistence of Celtic naming conventions within Romanized administrative contexts. The text, which appears to record legal proceedings or property transactions, includes numerous personal names that follow Celtic morphological patterns, while incorporating Latin grammatical structures required for Roman legal documentation. Names like Ambatus, Segontius, and Retigenes demonstrate the continued vitality of Celtic linguistic traditions, even within formal legal contexts that operated according to Roman procedural requirements. Women's names preserved in these inscriptions reveal particularly interesting patterns of cultural continuity and adaptation. Celtic feminine name-forming suffixes appear consistently throughout the epigraphic record, with examples like Butia, Segontia, and Ambata demonstrating that traditional naming practices continued for women even as men increasingly adopted Roman nomenclature patterns required for participation in imperial administrative and military structures. This gender-based differentiation suggests that women may have served as primary preservers of indigenous cultural traditions within families that were otherwise adapting rapidly to Roman social expectations. The geographical distribution of Celtiberian inscriptions reveals the persistence of indigenous literacy practices in regions that might have been expected to undergo rapid Romanization due to their strategic importance or urban development. Sites throughout the Duero Valley and the Sistema Central Mountains have yielded inscribed materials that demonstrate continued use of the Celtiberian script well into the 1st century AD, long after Roman administrative systems had been established throughout these territories. This geographical pattern suggests that indigenous writing traditions served important cultural functions that extended beyond purely administrative requirements. Funerary inscriptions represent another crucial category of epigraphic evidence that illuminates the gradual transition from Celtiberian to Latin linguistic practices within religious and commemorative contexts. Early examples from the 1st century BC typically employ Celtiberian script and language for essential information including personal names, family relationships, and basic commemorative formulae, while later inscriptions show increasing incorporation of Latin vocabulary and grammatical structures. The bilingual inscriptions that appear during transitional periods provide direct evidence for the coexistence of both linguistic traditions within the same communities and even individual families. The funerary stela from Clunia exemplifies this transitional process through its combination of Celtic personal names with Latin commemorative formulae arranged according to Roman epigraphic conventions. The inscription honours an individual named Ambatus using traditional Celtic name forms, while employing Latin abbreviations and formulaic expressions that follow standard Roman funerary practices. The physical characteristics of the monument itself demonstrate similar cultural synthesis, with Celtic decorative motifs executed according to Roman sculptural techniques and compositional arrangements. Religious inscriptions from sanctuary sites throughout former Celtiberian territory provide evidence for the complex processes of theological syncretism that occurred as indigenous spiritual traditions adapted to Roman religious frameworks. Votive inscriptions dedicated to Celtic deities increasingly employ Latin language and Roman dedicatory formulae while preserving traditional divine epithets and ceremonial terminology that maintained connections to ancestral religious practices. These texts reveal sophisticated theological thinking that integrated Celtic and Roman religious concepts while preserving essential elements of indigenous spiritual traditions. The sanctuary inscriptions from Penalba de Villastar demonstrate the persistence of Celtic religious vocabulary within Romanized ceremonial contexts. The site has yielded numerous votive texts that honour traditional Celtic deities using Latin grammatical structures while preserving indigenous divine names and attributes. Dedications to Lugus appear alongside offerings to Mars, with inscriptions that employ Roman formulaic expressions while maintaining Celtic ceremonial terminology that connected these rituals to traditional religious practices important for community identity and spiritual continuity. Bilingual inscriptions represent the most direct evidence for this coexistence of Celtiberian and Latin linguistic traditions within the same communities during the transitional period of the 1st century BC through 1st century AD. These texts typically employ Celtiberian for personal names, family relationships, and traditional cultural concepts, while using Latin for administrative terminology, legal procedures, and official titles required for interaction with Roman governmental structures. The linguistic choices made in these inscriptions reveal sophisticated strategies for maintaining cultural identity while adapting to imperial administrative requirements. The bilingual bronze tablet from Botorita III provides exceptional insight into the practical applications of code switching between Celtiberian and Latin within official contexts. The text appears to record legal proceedings that involved both indigenous community members and Roman administrative officials, requiring translation between linguistic systems while maintaining legal precision in both languages. Celtiberian portions of the text preserve traditional legal terminology and procedural concepts, while Latin sections employ standard Roman legal formulae and administrative vocabulary required for imperial record-keeping purposes. Administrative documents from this period reveal the gradual displacement of Celtiberian by Latin in official contexts, while demonstrating the persistence of indigenous linguistic traditions in informal and ceremonial applications. Tax records, legal contracts, and governmental correspondence increasingly employ Latin vocabulary and grammatical structures, while personal correspondence and religious texts continue utilizing Celtiberian linguistic forms. This functional differentiation suggests that bilingualism served practical purposes for communities that needed to navigate both traditional social relationships and Roman administrative requirements. The survival of Celtic naming conventions within increasingly Romanized communities demonstrates the cultural importance attached to maintaining connections to ancestral identities even as other aspects of traditional life underwent dramatic transformation. Archaeological evidence from cemetery sites reveals that individuals with fully Roman names often received burial treatment that incorporated traditional Celtiberian practices, including weapon deposits, ceramic vessels, and grave goods arrangements that followed indigenous cultural patterns rather than Roman funerary customs. The cemetery at Caratiers provides extensive evidence for this cultural continuity within changing linguistic practices. Grave markers from the 1st century AD employ Latin inscriptions and Roman commemorative formulae, while the associated burials include traditional Celtic grave goods and follow indigenous spatial arrangements that maintained connections to ancestral burial customs. Personal names appearing on these monuments frequently combine Roman gentilicia with Celtic cognomina that preserve tribal affiliations and family heritage, important for maintaining social relationships within local communities. Religious terminology preserved in late Celtiberian inscriptions reveals the sophisticated theological vocabulary that had developed within indigenous spiritual traditions over centuries of cultural development. Terms relating to divine attributes, ceremonial procedures, and sacred obligations appear in contexts that demonstrate their continued importance for community religious life, even as Roman religious practices gained prominence in official contexts. This specialized vocabulary suggests that traditional religious practices continued serving important cultural functions that Roman religious innovations could not entirely replace. The votive inscriptions from Numantia's rebuilt sanctuary complex illustrate the persistence of Celtic religious concepts within Roman architectural and ceremonial frameworks. Dedications to traditional Celtic deities employ indigenous theological terminology while following Roman epigraphic conventions and utilizing Latin grammatical structures required for official religious documentation. These texts preserve Celtic divine epithets and ceremonial formulae while demonstrating adaptation to Roman religious administrative requirements that governed official sanctuary operations. Craft specialization terminology appearing in Celtiberian inscriptions provides evidence for the continuation of traditional technical knowledge and production methods within communities that were otherwise undergoing rapid cultural transformation. Terms relating to metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture appear in contexts that suggest the preservation of indigenous technical vocabularies alongside the adoption of Roman commercial practices and market relationships. This specialized terminology indicates that traditional craft knowledge continued serving important economic functions, even as production methods adapted to serve Roman market demands. The inscribed potter's marks and metalworkers' signatures found throughout former Celtiberian territory demonstrate the persistence of traditional craft identities within increasingly monetized economic relationships. These marks typically employ Celtic personal names and traditional symbols, while appearing on products that were manufactured according to Roman technical specifications and distributed through imperial commercial networks. The combination of indigenous cultural markers with Roman production standards suggests that craft specialists maintained connections to traditional cultural identities while adapting their skills to serve new market opportunities. Legal terminology preserved in late Celtiberian inscriptions reveals the sophisticated jurisprudential concepts that had developed within indigenous legal traditions over centuries of tribal governance. Terms relating to property rights, inheritance procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms appear in contexts that demonstrate their continued relevance for community legal practices even as Roman legal procedures gain prominence in official contexts. This specialized vocabulary suggests that traditional legal concepts continued serving important social functions that Roman legal innovations could not entirely replace without creating significant cultural disruption. The bronze tablet from Contrebia Belaiska preserves legal terminology that demonstrates the adaptation of Celtic jurisprudential concepts to Roman administrative requirements. The text employs traditional Celtiberian terms for property relationships and community obligations, while utilizing Latin grammatical structures and legal formulae required for Roman governmental documentation. This linguistic synthesis reveals sophisticated legal thinking that integrated indigenous and Roman jurisprudential concepts while maintaining cultural continuity in community governance practices. Archaeological evidence for the survival of traditional cultural practices within Romanized communities appears throughout former Celtiberian territory, in contexts that demonstrate the persistence of indigenous social customs alongside the adoption of Roman material culture and architectural styles. Settlement excavations reveal the continuation of traditional household organization patterns, food preparation methods, and craft production techniques within buildings that followed Roman architectural principles and utilized imperial construction materials and decorative styles. The residential quarter at Tierme provides extensive evidence for this cultural continuity within changing material contexts. Houses constructed according to Roman architectural principles during the 1st century AD contain hearth arrangements, storage systems, and workshop areas that follow traditional Celtiberian domestic organization patterns, while incorporating Roman innovations in heating, ventilation, and water management. Artifact assemblages from these contexts include Roman-style pottery and metal objects alongside traditional Celtic personal ornaments and ceremonial items that maintained connections to ancestral cultural practices. Religious syncretism in archaeological contexts reveals the complex processes of spiritual adaptation that occurred as indigenous communities integrated Roman religious practices with traditional Celtic spiritual traditions. Sanctuary sites throughout the region show the gradual modification of traditional sacred spaces to accommodate Roman religious architectural requirements while preserving indigenous ceremonial features and spatial arrangements that maintained connections to ancestral spiritual practices. The sanctuary complex at Postolobosso demonstrates this syncretic development through its combination of Roman temple architecture with traditional Celtic sacred features, including ritual pools, weapon deposits, and animal sacrifice areas that continued serving indigenous ceremonial requirements. Votive deposits from the site include Roman-style religious offerings, alongside traditional Celtic dedicatory items that preserve connections to ancestral spiritual practices while demonstrating adaptation to Roman religious administrative frameworks. The gradual integration of Celtiberian elites into Roman administrative and military hierarchies represented one of the most significant transformations in the post-conquest period, fundamentally altering the social structure of Central Iberian communities while creating new pathways for indigenous leadership within imperial frameworks. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites dating to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD reveals the material manifestations of this social mobility, with grave goods that combine traditional Celtic status symbols alongside Roman military decorations and administrative insignia that marked advancement within imperial service structures. The cemetery at Clunia provides exceptional documentation of this elite integration process through burial assemblages that demonstrate the career progression of indigenous aristocrats who successfully navigated Roman administrative hierarchies. Tombs from the Flavian period contain traditional Celtic weapons and jewellery, alongside Roman military equipment, including bronze cavalry medals, decorated belt fittings, and ceremonial armour that marks service in auxiliary units or provincial administrative positions. The most elaborate burials include imported luxury goods from throughout the Mediterranean world, indicating access to commercial networks and purchasing power that derive from successful participation in imperial economic systems. Military service represented the primary avenue for Celtiberian advancement within Roman hierarchical structures, building upon traditional warrior culture while redirecting martial skills toward imperial objectives. The auxiliary units recruited from former Celtiberian territories became renowned throughout the empire for their cavalry expertise and mountain warfare capabilities, serving in campaigns from Britain to Dacia, where their specialised skills proved invaluable for Roman military operations. Inscriptions from military installations across the empire document the service records of Celtiberian officers who achieved significant rank within auxiliary commands while maintaining connections to their ancestral communities. The cohors Celtiberorum, attested in military diplomas and tombstone inscriptions from various frontier regions, exemplifies the integration of traditional Celtiberian military expertise into Roman army organisation. Unit members retained their ethnic identity while serving imperial strategic objectives, creating hybrid military cultures that combined Roman discipline and organisation with indigenous tactical knowledge and warrior traditions. Officers from these units frequently returned to their home communities after completing military service, bringing Roman administrative experience and imperial connections that facilitated their appointment to local governmental positions. Equestrian careers became increasingly accessible to wealthy Celtiberian families during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, as imperial administrators recognized the value of incorporating local elites into provincial governance structures. The cursus honorum inscriptions from Sega Briga and other urban centres document the progression of indigenous aristocrats through municipal magistracies toward provincial administrative positions that required Roman citizenship and demonstrated loyalty to imperial institutions. These career paths typically began with local offices including duumvirates and aedileships, before advancing to provincial positions that involved tax collection, judicial responsibilities, and military command functions. The family of Gaius Valerius Avitus, documented through inscriptions from Uxima and related sites, illustrates the multi-generational process of elite integration that characterized successful Celtiberian adaptation to Roman social structures. The earliest family members mentioned in the epigraphic record held local magistracies during the Julio-Claudian period, while maintaining traditional Celtic names and cultural markers. Later generations adopted fully Roman nomenclature while achieving equestrian rank and provincial administrative positions that connected them to imperial networks extending throughout Hispania and beyond. Administrative positions within provincial government required Celtiberian elites to develop expertise in Roman legal procedures, fiscal management, and bureaucratic practices that differed significantly from traditional tribal governance methods. Training for these roles typically occurred through apprenticeships with established Roman administrators or through service in junior positions that provided practical experience with imperial administrative procedures. The legal knowledge required for judicial positions necessitated familiarity with Roman law codes, precedent systems, and court procedures that operated according to principles fundamentally different from indigenous legal traditions. The transformation of traditional Celtiberian settlements into Roman municipia and coloniae created new urban environments that preserved strategic locations while adapting them to serve imperial administrative and economic functions. The elevated defensive positions that had made these sites valuable for tribal warfare proved equally advantageous for Roman purposes, providing commanding views over surrounding territories while offering natural protection for administrative centres and commercial facilities. The adaptation of existing settlements avoided the massive construction costs associated with establishing entirely new urban centres while maintaining continuity with traditional territorial relationships that local populations understood and accepted. Numantia's reconstruction as a Roman municipium, beginning in the late 2nd century BC, established the template for urban transformation throughout the region. Roman engineers preserved the site's commanding position while completely reorganizing the internal layout according to imperial urban planning principles. The new street system followed orthogonal patterns that facilitated administrative functions and commercial activities, while the Forum complex occupied the central plateau area, where traditional tribal assemblies had previously convened. Public buildings, including basilicas, temples, and bath complexes, introduced Roman architectural forms while incorporating local stoneworking techniques and decorative elements that maintained connections to indigenous artistic traditions. The legal status of municipium granted to former Celtiberian settlements provided their inhabitants with defined rights and obligations within the Roman legal system, while preserving certain aspects of local governance that facilitated community acceptance of imperial authority. Municipal charters typically allowed continued application of traditional legal procedures for internal disputes, while requiring conformity to Roman law for matters involving imperial taxation, military service, and inter-community relationships. This legal framework created hybrid governmental systems that combined Roman administrative efficiency with indigenous decision-making processes that local populations understood and trusted. Segeda's transformation into the municipium of Segeda illustrates the practical implementation of this legal framework within a community that had previously served as a major centre of resistance to Roman expansion. The settlement's strategic location in the Jalon Valley made it valuable for controlling trade routes between the Ebro Basin and the central Meseta, while its substantial population provided the human resources necessary for effective municipal administration. Roman investment in urban infrastructure, including aqueducts, public buildings, and improved fortifications, demonstrated imperial commitment to the site's continued importance while creating employment opportunities for local craftsmen and labourers. Colonial foundations represented a more intensive form of Roman urban development that involved the settlement of veteran soldiers alongside indigenous populations, creating mixed communities that combined imperial administrative expertise with local knowledge and cultural traditions. The Colonia of Caesar Augusta, established at the confluence of the Ebro, Huerva, and Gallego rivers, became the primary urban centre for the entire region while serving as a model for colonial development throughout former Celtiberian territories. The settlement's location provided excellent access to transportation networks while offering abundant water resources and fertile agricultural lands that could support substantial urban populations. The urban planning of Caesar Augusta incorporated advanced Roman engineering techniques, including sophisticated water supply systems, sewerage networks, and public building complexes that demonstrated imperial technological capabilities while providing practical facilities that improved living conditions for all residents. The Forum complex featured monumental architecture that proclaimed Roman power and cultural achievement while providing spaces for commercial activities and public gatherings that served the practical needs of diverse urban populations. Theatre and amphitheatre facilities introduced Roman entertainment traditions while creating venues for public ceremonies that reinforced imperial political messaging. Military veterans settled in these colonial foundations brought specialized skills and imperial connections that facilitated economic development while providing security for frontier regions that remained potentially unstable. These colonists typically received land grants that included both urban properties and agricultural holdings, creating mixed farming and commercial economies that connected rural production with urban markets and Mediterranean trade networks. The integration of veteran settlers with indigenous populations required careful management to prevent conflicts while encouraging cooperation that benefited both groups. The cultural contributions of Celtiberian traditions to the broader development of Hispano-Roman identity became particularly evident in military practices and craft specializations that enhanced imperial capabilities while preserving indigenous knowledge and techniques. The superior metallurgical skills developed by Celtiberian smiths over centuries of specialized production found new applications in serving Roman military requirements, with weapon and tool production that exceeded imperial standards while maintaining traditional quality control methods and artistic decorative programs. Military traditions derived from Celtiberian warrior culture influenced Roman auxiliary unit organization and tactical procedures throughout the empire, particularly in cavalry operations and mountain warfare applications. where indigenous expertise proved superior to standard Roman methods. The emphasis on individual combat skills and weapon mastery that characterized traditional Celtiberian military training enhanced Roman military effectiveness, while preserving cultural practices that maintained community, identity, and social cohesion. Training methods developed within tribal warrior societies provided models for Roman military education that improved soldier preparation while reducing training costs and time requirements. Cavalry techniques developed by Celtiberian horsemen became standard practices throughout Roman auxiliary forces, with riding skills and horse management methods that demonstrated superior effectiveness compared to Mediterranean cavalry traditions. The small, hardy horses bred in the Central Highlands proved ideally suited for reconnaissance operations, rapid communications, and pursuit actions that required endurance and agility rather than size and strength. Breeding programs established under Roman administration preserved these bloodlines, while expanding production to meet military demands throughout the Western Empire. Metalworking specializations that had distinguished Celtiberian craftsmen continued serving important economic functions within Roman commercial systems, while adapting to serve new market demands and production requirements. The pattern welding techniques employed for sword production found applications in tool manufacturing and architectural metalwork that enhanced building construction, while reducing material costs through efficient use of iron and steel resources. Decorative metalworking skills developed for traditional jewelry and ceremonial objects adapted to serve Roman luxury markets, while preserving artistic traditions that maintain cultural continuity. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites throughout former Celtiberian territory reveals the continuation of traditional production methods within Roman commercial frameworks, with craft specializations that serve both local community needs and export markets extending throughout Hispania and beyond. Pottery production facilities at sites like Tritium Megallum developed standardized manufacturing processes that combined traditional ceramic techniques with Roman market requirements, producing terra sigillata and other specialized wares that competed successfully with products from established Mediterranean production centers. The persistence of Celtic cultural elements in rural areas throughout the imperial period demonstrates the selective nature of Romanization processes that concentrated on urban centers and strategic locations, while allowing traditional practices to continue in agricultural communities where they served practical functions and maintained social stability. Archaeological survey of rural settlement sites reveals the continuation of traditional house forms, agricultural techniques, and craft production methods well into the 3rd century AD, indicating that cultural transformation proceeded at different rates depending on local conditions and imperial administrative priorities. Rural religious practices preserved Celtic spiritual traditions within syncretic frameworks that incorporated Roman deities and ceremonial procedures, while maintaining connections to ancestral sacred sites and seasonal celebrations that regulated agricultural activities. Sanctuary sites in remote highland locations continued receiving votive offerings that followed traditional Celtic patterns while adapting to Roman religious administrative requirements that governed official recognition and tax obligations. The persistence of Celtic divine names and ceremonial terminology in rural religious contexts indicates the continued vitality of indigenous spiritual traditions even as urban religious practices became increasingly Romanized. Agricultural techniques developed by Celtiberian communities over centuries of adaptation to highland environmental conditions continued serving important functions within Roman provincial economies that required reliable food production for urban populations and military garrisons. Traditional crop rotation systems, livestock management practices, and soil conservation methods proved superior to Mediterranean agricultural techniques when applied to the challenging climate and terrain conditions of the central Meseta. Roman agricultural writers including Columella acknowledged the effectiveness of indigenous farming methods while recommending their adoption in similar environmental conditions throughout the empire. Settlement patterns in rural areas preserved traditional relationships between communities and their natural environments, while adapting to Roman administrative requirements for taxation and military recruitment. Village sites continued occupying defensible positions that provided security during periods of instability, while offering access to agricultural resources and transportation routes that connected them to urban markets and imperial administrative centres. The persistence of traditional settlement locations indicates the continued relevance of indigenous territorial knowledge and environmental adaptation strategies that served practical functions, regardless of changing political circumstances. Family structures and social organisation in rural communities maintained traditional patterns that emphasised extended kinship relationships and reciprocal obligation systems, while adapting to Roman legal requirements that governed inheritance, property rights, and civic responsibilities. Marriage customs preserved Celtic ceremonial elements, while conforming to Roman legal procedures that recognised legitimate unions and determined inheritance rights. Child-rearing practices maintained a traditional emphasis on practical skill development and cultural education, while incorporating Roman educational opportunities that provided pathways for social advancement through military or administrative service. The survival of Celtic cultural elements within Roman provincial society created distinctive regional characteristics that distinguished Hispano-Roman culture from other imperial territories, while contributing to the broader development of provincial identities that combined imperial and indigenous elements. This cultural synthesis produced artistic styles, architectural forms, and social practices that were recognisably Roman, while preserving essential elements of pre-conquest traditions that maintained community cohesion and cultural continuity. The success of this integration process provided models for Roman administration in other Celtic territories, while demonstrating the practical benefits of accommodating indigenous traditions within imperial frameworks rather than attempting their complete elimination. The transformation of Celtiberian cultural elements within Roman provincial society established foundations for historical memory that would persist through subsequent centuries of political upheaval and cultural change. As the Western Roman Empire experienced increasing instability during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, writers and chroniclers began looking backward to earlier periods of Hispanic history for examples of valour and resistance that could inspire contemporary audiences facing barbarian invasions and imperial collapse. The Celtiberian Wars, particularly the Siege of Numantia, emerged as paradigmatic examples of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, providing narrative frameworks that later authors would adapt to serve different political and cultural objectives. Paulus Orosius, writing his Historiarum Adversum Paganos Libri VII in the early 5th century, devoted considerable attention to the Celtiberian conflicts as demonstrations of divine providence operating through historical events. His account of Numantia's destruction emphasized the moral dimensions of the struggle while interpreting Celtiberian resistance as preparation for the eventual triumph of Christianity in Hispania. Orosius drew explicit parallels between Numantian defenders choosing death over slavery and Christian martyrs accepting persecution rather than abandoning their faith, creating interpretive frameworks that connected pre-Roman indigenous history with contemporary religious struggles. The Chronicle of Hydatius, composed during the mid-5th century as Visigothic kingdoms consolidated control over former Roman territories, referenced Celtiberian military prowess as evidence for the martial capabilities of Hispanic populations. Hydatius emphasized the tactical innovations and weapon quality that had distinguished Celtiberian warriors, while suggesting that these military traditions continued influencing contemporary resistance to barbarian invasions. His references to Celtiberian metallurgical expertise provided historical precedents for the superior weapons produced in Toledo and other Hispanic centres during the Visigothic period. Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae and Historia Gothorum preserved detailed information about Celtiberian origins and cultural characteristics, while integrating this material into comprehensive accounts of Hispanic historical development. Isidore's etymological analyses of tribal names and place names demonstrated scholarly interest in pre-Roman linguistic traditions, while his historical narratives emphasized continuities between ancient Hispanic resistance and contemporary Visigothic military achievements. The Historia Gothorum explicitly connected Celtiberian territorial control with later Visigothic expansion, suggesting that indigenous political traditions had influenced subsequent governmental structures. Medieval chroniclers writing during the Reconquista period discovered new relevance in Celtiberian resistance narratives that paralleled contemporary struggles against Islamic expansion. The Primera Chronica General, commissioned by Alfonso X in the 13th century, devoted extensive attention to Numantia's siege, while drawing explicit comparisons between Celtiberian resistance to Rome and Christian resistance to Muslim conquest. The Chronicle's account emphasized the religious dimensions of both conflicts, while portraying Numantian defenders as proto-Christian heroes whose sacrifice prepared Hispanic territories for eventual Christian triumph. The Crónica de España by Lucas de Tuy similarly emphasized connections between ancient Hispanic resistance and contemporary military campaigns, using Celtiberian examples to demonstrate the historical precedents for successful resistance against foreign domination. Lucas's narrative techniques transformed historical accounts into moral exemplar that supported contemporary political objectives while preserving detailed information about ancient military practices and territorial relationships. His descriptions of Celtiberian weapons and tactics provided models for medieval military innovations, while maintaining historical accuracy regarding ancient technological capabilities. Renaissance humanist scholars rediscovered classical sources on Celtiberian history as part of broader efforts to establish scholarly foundations for emerging concepts of Spanish national identity. Antonio de Nebrijas, Rerum Fernando et Elisabe Hispaniarum, Felicissimus Regibus Gestarum. Decades incorporated extensive references to Celtiberian resistance as evidence for the inherent martial capabilities of Spanish populations. Nebrija's philological analysis of ancient tribal names and linguistic evidence demonstrated scholarly methods that would influence subsequent historical research, while supporting political arguments for Spanish cultural superiority based on historical precedents. Florian de Ocampo's Crónica General de España represented the most comprehensive Renaissance treatment of Celtiberian history, combining classical sources with archaeological observations and linguistic analysis to create detailed reconstructions of ancient Hispanic societies. Ocampo's work demonstrated sophisticated understanding of source criticism and historical methodology, while serving political objectives that emphasize Spanish cultural achievements and territorial rights. His descriptions of Celtiberian metallurgy and craftsmanship provided evidence for technological innovations that had influenced European development, while establishing Spanish claims to historical precedents in various fields. The establishment of the Royal Academy of History in 1738 marked the beginning of systematic scholarly investigation of Celtiberian history, based on rigorous examination of archaeological evidence and critical analysis of literary sources. Academy members, including Enrique Flores and his collaborators on the España Sagrada project, established methodological standards for historical research while accumulating substantial documentation of Celtiberian sites, inscriptions, and material culture. Their work established foundations for modern archaeological investigation, while preserving crucial evidence that might otherwise have been lost to development and neglect. Enlightenment interest in Celtiberian history reflected broader European fascination with Celtic origins and cultural achievements that challenged classical assumptions about barbarian primitiveness and Roman cultural superiority. Spanish scholars, including Gregorio Mayans y Ciscar and Juan Bautista Muñoz, developed sophisticated arguments for Celtiberian technological and artistic achievements that equalled or exceeded contemporary Roman capabilities. Their research emphasized metallurgical innovations, architectural accomplishments, and social organization systems that demonstrated indigenous cultural sophistication while supporting Spanish claims to historical greatness independent of Roman influence. The archaeological investigations initiated during the 18th and 19th centuries provided the first systematic documentation of Celtiberian material culture based on controlled excavation and scientific analysis rather than antiquarian collecting and literary speculation. The excavations at Numantia, conducted under the direction of Eduardo Saavedra, beginning in 1853, established methodological precedents for Spanish archaeology while recovering substantial evidence for Celtiberian urban planning, defensive architecture, and daily life practices. Saavedra's careful documentation of stratigraphic relationships and artifact associations provided models for subsequent archaeological work while recovering crucial evidence for Celtiberian cultural achievements. The establishment of archaeological museums in Madrid, Barcelona, and other Spanish cities during the 19th century created institutional frameworks for preserving and studying Celtiberian artifacts while making this material accessible to broader public audiences. Museum collections assembled during this period included substantial holdings of Celtiberian weapons, jewellery, pottery, and architectural fragments that provided evidence for technological capabilities and artistic achievements. Exhibition programs developed by museum professionals emphasized the sophistication of pre-Roman Hispanic cultures while supporting educational objectives that promoted Spanish cultural identity and historical consciousness. 20th century archaeological investigations revolutionized understanding of Celtiberian society through the application of scientific excavation techniques, interdisciplinary analysis methods, and theoretical frameworks derived from anthropological and sociological research. The systematic excavations at Numantia, conducted by Adolf Schulten between 1905 and 1912, established new standards for archaeological methodology while recovering extensive evidence for Celtiberian urban organization, military technology, and cultural practices. Schulten's detailed publication of his findings provided comprehensive documentation that remains essential for Celtiberian studies while demonstrating the potential of scientific archaeology for historical reconstruction. The development of settlement archaeology during the mid-20th century enabled comprehensive investigation of Celtiberian territorial organization and economic systems through systematic survey and excavation of entire regional landscapes. Projects including the Upper Duero Survey and the Celtiberian Settlement Project documented hundreds of sites ranging from major urban centres to small rural settlements, revealing the complexity of Celtiberian social organisation and economic relationships. These investigations demonstrated the sophistication of indigenous political systems while providing evidence for technological innovations and cultural achievements that challenged previous assumptions about pre-Roman Hispanic development. Metallurgical analysis of Celtiberian weapons and tools using modern scientific techniques reveal the exceptional quality of indigenous metalworking, while documenting technological innovations that influenced subsequent European development. X-ray analysis, electron microscopy, and chemical composition studies demonstrated that Celtiberian smiths had developed advanced techniques for steel production, pattern welding, and decorative inlay work that exceeded contemporary Roman capabilities. These discoveries provided scientific validation for classical literary references to superior Celtiberian weapons while documenting technological achievements that contributed to broader European metallurgical development. Linguistic research on Celtiberian inscriptions, using comparative Indo-European methodology, established the Celtic character of the language, while documenting its relationship to other ancient Celtic languages and its contributions to later Hispanic linguistic development. The decipherment of the Botorita bronzes and other major inscriptions revealed sophisticated legal and administrative vocabulary that demonstrated the complexity of Celtiberian political institutions. A nomastic analysis of personal names preserved in inscriptions provided evidence for social organization patterns and cultural practices while documenting the persistence of Celtic naming traditions within Roman provincial society. Contemporary archaeological investigations continue revealing new aspects of Celtiberian civilization through the application of advanced scientific techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, and geographic information system analysis. Recent excavations at sites including Segida, Contrebia, Belaisca, and Tiermes have documented previously unknown aspects of Celtiberian urban planning, craft specialization, and regional integration, while providing evidence for cultural continuities that persisted through the Roman period. These discoveries demonstrate the ongoing potential for archaeological research to enhance understanding of Celtiberian society, while raising new questions about cultural identity, ethnogenesis, and historical interpretation. Modern scholarly debates regarding Celtiberian identity reflect broader theoretical discussions about ethnicity, cultural boundaries, and historical interpretation that characterize contemporary archaeological and historical research. Some scholars emphasize the Celtic characteristics of Celtiberian culture, while others stress indigenous Iberian elements, creating ongoing discussions about the relative importance of migration versus local development and cultural formation processes. These debates reflect different theoretical approaches to understanding cultural identity and historical change, while demonstrating the complexity of interpreting archaeological evidence for ancient, ethnic, and cultural relationships. The question of Celtic ethnogenesis in Iberia remains particularly contentious, with scholars proposing various models for the arrival and integration of Celtic populations with indigenous groups. Migration models emphasize the arrival of Celtic-speaking populations from beyond the Pyrenees, while indigenous theories stressed local development of Celtic cultural characteristics through cultural diffusion and gradual transformation. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that both processes operated simultaneously, creating complex patterns of cultural development that resist simple explanatory models while demonstrating the sophistication of ancient cultural interaction processes. Material culture interpretation presents ongoing challenges for scholars attempting to understand the relationship between artifacts and cultural identity in ancient contexts. The presence of Celtic-style objects in Celtiberian contexts might indicate ethnic Celtic identity, cultural borrowing, trade relationships, or local production of foreign styles, creating interpretive ambiguities that reflect broader theoretical problems in archaeological analysis. Contemporary scholars increasingly emphasize the need for multiple lines of evidence, including linguistic, archaeological, and historical data, while recognizing the limitations of material culture for determining ancient ethnic identities. The legacy of Celtiberian civilization in modern Spanish culture extends far beyond academic historical research, influencing contemporary literature, art, and political discourse, while providing symbols and narratives that support various aspects of regional and national identity formation. The heroic resistance of Numantia has become a powerful symbol of Spanish determination and independence, referenced in contexts ranging from the Spanish Civil War to contemporary political movements. This symbolic usage demonstrates the continued relevance of ancient historical narratives for modern cultural and political objectives, while illustrating the complex relationships between historical scholarship and contemporary identity formation. Regional museums throughout Castile and Aragon continue developing exhibitions and educational programs that present Celtiberian history to diverse public audiences while supporting tourism and cultural heritage preservation objectives. These institutions serve crucial functions in preserving archaeological materials and historical knowledge, while making scholarly research accessible to broader populations. Educational programs developed by museum professionals emphasize the sophistication of pre-Roman Hispanic cultures while encouraging public appreciation for archaeological research and cultural heritage preservation. The establishment of archaeological parks at major Celtiberian sites, including Numantia, Segida, and Tiermes, provides public access to important historical locations while supporting conservation efforts and educational objectives. These facilities combine site preservation with interpretive programs that explain Celtiberian history and culture to visitors while demonstrating the methods and findings of archaeological research. The development of these parks reflects growing public interest in pre-Roman Hispanic history, while providing economic benefits for local communities through heritage tourism and cultural programming. Contemporary archaeological research continues expanding knowledge of Celtiberian civilization, while raising new questions about cultural identity, historical interpretation, and the relationship between material culture and ethnicity. Recent discoveries at sites throughout the former Celtiberian territories provide evidence for previously unknown aspects of social organization, economic systems, and cultural practices, while demonstrating the ongoing potential for archaeological investigation to enhance historical understanding. These continuing discoveries ensure that Celtiberian studies will remain a dynamic field of research that contributes to broader understanding of ancient European cultural development and the complex processes of cultural interaction and identity formation that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world. The Celtiberians thus emerge from historical obscurity not merely as fierce opponents of Roman expansion, but as sophisticated peoples whose cultural achievements and historical experiences continue informing contemporary understanding of ancient European development, cultural identity formation, and the complex relationships between indigenous populations and imperial powers. Their legacy persists in the archaeological record, linguistic evidence, and historical memory that connects modern Spain to its pre-Roman past, while demonstrating the enduring significance of cultural synthesis and adaptation in human historical experience.